I can now officially say good afternoon, as it is noon. Welcome to the Education Funding Task Force. Appreciate everyone being here. Good to see everyone again. Thank you for being flexible in moving our normal monthly meeting to a week later and a little different day. So appreciate everyone's effort to be here and make that change. Thank you to all of you who are here in the audience. Appreciate you being here as well. So today and tomorrow we will be discussing special education funding. And if you've looked at the agenda, you will notice that there's some overview and review. We have done a lot of laying of groundwork on this topic previously, so please don't think this is just the same things we did a few months ago. What we will be doing is maybe a little refresher, but digging in deeper on specific topics that will hopefully help lead us to making any potential changes that we see would be beneficial. So I know it says overview and review, but just know that it's a deeper dive into what we've already done up to this point. So with that, we will get started with an overview of the history of the special education funding and weighting from Nick Myers from the Office of the Revisers.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, members of the task force. I've got two memos that I'm going to present from today. The first one that I'm going to present from is an overview of state special education funding. This memo covers the excess cost formula that I'm going to discuss here soon. It then covers and how the state funds special education using that excess cost formula. It then goes into how the state distributes special education state aid separate and apart from that excess cost formula. And then I'll touch on the special education funds of school districts and then also the special education weighting and how it works within the KISA school finance formula. So first, the excess cost formula that you all are aware of. So state statute 723422 establishes a statutory formula that the state uses to determine how to appropriate special education state aid to school districts each school year. So this statutory formula calculates the statewide excess cost for the provision of special education and related services. This excess cost formula, as it's provided in statute, does say that it is subject to appropriation of the legislature, the amount that will be appropriated for special education state aid, but this formula and in the statute does state that the total amount of special education state aid that shall be appropriated to school districts is 92% of the excess cost determination that you determine pursuant to this formula. Statute also does provide that if the amount is insufficient to meet that statutory funding goal, the amount that then is prorated among all school districts. So with regard to excess costs, I've got a footnote down there that kind of generally describes what excess costs is, and it's really the cost that is above and beyond regular costs of education, the cost that it takes to educate special education students and provide special education services. So again, the costs above regular education costs that are expended for the special education students, those above and beyond costs for special education services. So to calculate the statewide excess cost for this in this formula, this formula requires the state board to generally do the following three things. First, determine the total amount of special education expenditures that are made by all school districts across the state. Then the formula requires a calculation and a subtraction of the average annual per student amount of regular education dollars that are expended on special education students. So in other words, subtract regular education dollars that are expended on those special education students from this formula to get the excess costs. The final subtraction in this formula is then to subtract other dedicated funding sources that are provided for special education. This includes federal funds, Medicaid funds, and then funds received under contracts with state institutions. You'll see in my memo, I've got a table there, and this table defines how that step 2 is determined. So that's step 2, calculating those regular education dollars. And you can see in this step 2, to calculate the regular education dollars, the calculation is to determine the per student cost to provide a regular education from school district general funds. That's the first step, determine it from general funds. So you multiply the base aid by the total weighted full-time equivalent enrollment of all school districts, and then you exclude certain weightings. And you can see that in that first bullet point of calculation A there in the table of the excluded weightings. Then you divide that amount by the total non-weighted enrollment to determine the amount expended on general funds per student, the average amount of general funds expended for regular education per student. And then you attribute those costs in calculation B to the special education students that are across all school districts. So you apply that general average amount per student to the special education students. And then in factor C, or in calculation C, then you factor in the local option budget, the amount of regular education dollars that are coming from the local option budget. And there's a specific calculation in statute to factor in those local option budget regular education dollars. So that's the calculation for regular education dollars. That's how the excess costs are determined pursuant to statute. And as I said, that 92%, that goal is then based on that excess cost formula. So that's how to fund special education. That's what statute says the legislature is to do to determine funding for special education. That's different than the distribution of special education state aid. So once the amount is determined for how much the state is going to fund special education state aid, state law then directs how the distribution is to be made of that total state aid amount. So generally, and the long-running thing in Kansas, and you can see on page 3 of my memo, this has been the way that state aid has been distributed to school districts. The first distribution that occurs is from that total state aid amount is the catastrophic state aid. So this is reimbursement provided for high-cost students, and the reimbursement rate is 75% of the costs that exceed twice the amount of the special teacher reimbursement entitlement, which we'll get to here in just a sec. The next one is Medicaid replacement state aid. This is a separate statute, and under this statute, the state board is required to designate and distribute a portion of that state special education state aid as Medicaid replacement state aid. This amount shall not exceed $9 million, and then it's just generally distributed to school districts based on the number of special education students who are Medicaid eligible within each district. The next reimbursement is the transportation and maintenance cost. So special education transportation is reimbursed to school districts at 80% of the actual travel and maintenance costs that are incurred by school districts. And then lastly, after doing those reimbursements, the special teacher reimbursement is then used. Whatever is the remaining amount of money from those first 3 reimbursements from special education state aid, it then goes to school districts based on the number of full-time equivalent special education teachers and paraprofessionals that are employed by the school district as compared to the total amount that are employed throughout the state. KSA 723422 does provide, this is a change that was made in 2024 by the legislature. It does provide that in fiscal year 2025 and each fiscal year thereafter, any amount that's appropriated for special education state aid that is above, as you see on page 3, an amount that exceeds that $528 million amount that you see there, that is then to be distributed to school districts not pursuant to the distribution methodology that I just described, but pursuant to a distribution methodology that is determined by the State Board of Education. And the statute describes this as a special education equalization distribution schedule that is to be established by the State Board, as I said. I will note that the statute does require that when establishing this equalization distribution schedule, the statute says that the State Board of Education shall give consideration to the discrepancies between each individual school district's excess cost amount as determined pursuant to another statute, which determines individual school districts' excess costs for special education. And I think Matt is going to have some examples and describe that distribution methodology that the State Board of Education uses pursuant to this statutory provision, the methodology they came up with to distribute that additional amount above the $528 million for special education state aid. So we covered funding, distribution. I want to touch on the special education and related services weighting within the Kansas School Equity and Enhancement Act. So there is within the KESA, the school finance formula, there is the special education weighting that's in there for school finance purposes. And I want to highlight why it's in there for school finance purposes. This weighting is simply determined by the amount. Take the amount that a school district receives pursuant to their special education distribution and divide it by the base state aid. So once you run it back through the formula, you multiply by the base state aid and it gets back to the amount that they would otherwise be distributed from special education funds. However, special education dollars aren't distributed to school districts as state aid under the KESA school finance formula. These monies, special education monies, are subtracted out as local effort monies under that formula. So what this does, because it's a weighting, it does impact a school district's total foundation aid under the KESA. It's subtracted out as local foundation aid. Anything that's subtracted out as local foundation aid does not get distributed as state foundation aid. But as I said, it impacts total foundation aid. Remember that. So what that does is for local option budget purposes, the local option budget is determined based on the total foundation aid amount. So special education weighting, that weighting does impact how much a district can levy with their local option budget. So as I say in this memo, because it's included as a part of the total foundation aid under the school finance formula, school districts can levy a greater amount under their local option budget had that not been included, if that was not included within this finance formula as total foundation aid, as being considered as total foundation aid. So it acts to increase local option budget authorization for school districts. Last, Madam Chair and members of the task force, just wanted to touch on school district special education funds. So statute requires each school district to have a special education fund and have that established for the district. And then any monies that the district receives from state or federal sources for special education purposes are to be deposited in that special education fund. And then I also want to touch on, additionally, there's a provision that was enacted in 2024 in the local option budget statute that requires local option budget monies, any monies that are going to the supplemental general fund, the local option budget, to also be transferred to the special education fund. And you can see in footnote 14, I say it's generally the amount that's attributable to that special education weighting that's raised in the local option budget is to be transferred into the special education fund. So there's local monies are going to special education fund based on what that weighting produces in that local calculation. And you can see the language in footnote 14, the specific statutory language there that requires that transfer from local option budget monies into the special education fund. And then lastly, districts, the statute requires all special education expenditures that districts are making have to be made from the special education fund of the school district. And Madam Chair, I've got one more memo to present on, and it's a history memo, but I'd be happy to stop here and answer any questions if that's the will of you and the task force.
Let's pause there and see if there are questions on this particular memorandum. Yes, Representative Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for presenting this information. I just wanted to do a quick clarification on the Medicaid replacement state aid. You mentioned that the school districts are receiving this, but this is for only truly billable Medicaid services via PT, OT, ST, or...
I am going to look to hopefully some lifelines from the Department of Education, specifically Dr. Frank Harwood, because he knows this pretty well.
Yes, so. Please. Mr. Harwood.
Yes, Dr. Harwood.
So the Medicaid replacement is not Medicaid funding, it is state funding, but it's $9 million of state funding set aside that is distributed based on the number of Medicaid or the number of students that received Medicaid eligible services. It goes back to 2008 when the state made a change in the way they were allowing Medicaid reimbursement to districts. They stopped allowing attendant care. And so that had a variety of impacts on districts. And so they set aside part of state aid as Medicaid replacement. The actual Medicaid dollars that districts receive is Medicaid reimbursement, which comes from KDHE. And in the formula, Nick, in the appropriations formula Nick talked about, those dollars get subtracted out of the total cost. And so it's just really important to understand that Medicaid replacement is not Medicaid funding. It is state funding that comes based on the number of students the district had that received Medicaid eligible services. Doesn't matter what the service was.
I'm good, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So that begs a question. Is this kind of like high density at risk? I mean, if we've got the fee-for-service Medicaid structure in schools, correct? So if we have that, then is this 9 million just for those that have a high population of Medicaid reimbursement students? What is the purpose of the 9 million? And I'm reading Nick and saying Dr. Harwood.
So KDHE gives KSDE a number of students in each district that received Medicaid eligible services. We take that 9 million divided by that number. I think it was like $580 some this past year. And then for every student that they had, we give them that portion of the $9 million as part of their special education state aid. So it is not connected to Medicaid reimbursement through the fee-for-service, except that in order to be counted as a student, you had to receive a Medicaid eligible service.
Is this to supplement the cost of service versus what they get in Medicaid reimbursement? What's the purpose of the 9 million per student?
So I believe the purpose goes back to there was a change in the way Medicaid reimbursement was distributed, or what the change in the eligibility for Medicaid reimbursement. What Medicaid replacement did was set aside some of the state aid to make up for that loss for districts that had more Medicaid reimbursement that they were not going to receive.
And where does this 9 million show up in as far as counting towards the cost of special education?
So like for this year, the Medicaid appropriation was $611 million. We'll subtract 9 million out of that 611 and distribute it through the Medicaid replacement state aid. So it's in the appropriation that that is made through the 92% calculation. It's just one of the 4 categories of the categorical aid that gets distributed.
How did the figure 9 million come about? And how long has it been 9 million? Is that not adjusted based on the number? I mean, just trying to understand where we get 9 million, what the purpose is, and where it figures into the finance formula. I'm seeing Nick shuffle, so I'm going to throw it back to Nick.
I think a key point, Madam Chair, that Frank said is that this is an amount that this 9 million is just distribute. It's just a distribution from that special education state aid appropriation. It just is within that total bucket of special education state aid. That 9 million just comes out of there and gets distributed pursuant to that per student Medicaid eligible per student model. I'm going to look. I believe I've got the statute, and let's see. Well, I don't have the statute in front of me for the Medicaid replacement state aid. But we can look at the statutory history and see when that came in and just see if any changes have been made. But I'll look before I speak on that.
Okay, I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to throw it to Vice Chair Estes.
Dr. Harwood, I'm thinking about that 9 million, and I'm thinking about dividing it evenly among students, and I'm thinking that districts, depending on the composition of their special ed population, and what the exceptionality is, has really drastically different expenses with it. So do we kind of harm districts by not being more specific on how we send that back? And I'd also like a clarifying question. So this is kind of, we do this 9 million, it's a kind of like to help cover what Medicaid, do other students use, do other districts do it different, other states do it differently, and we use the 9 million to cover what used to get covered under Medicaid? Educate me, please.
Dr. Harwood.
So without Medicaid replacement being part of the distribution formula, that $9 million would actually just be part of the special teacher reimbursement. Because again, we start with the $611 million. We take out catastrophic, which is about 1.3 million. We take out transportation, which was about 90 million. And then we take out Medicaid replacement, which was 9 million. And the rest goes to Medicaid, it goes to special teacher reimbursement. So whenever this happened, I think it was around 2008, the legislature decided to set aside, I think it's been 9 million the whole time, but I don't know that for sure, set aside $9 million to distribute to districts based on the number of students that received, that had paid Medicaid eligible services. And so it's a good point that some services are much more costly than others. That is not part of the formula in any way. It clearly is just the number that KDHE tells us we're eligible for each district.
In your opinion, do you think this might be why some states are going to tiers for special ed? So that, because, you know, every district can have a totally different composition, and then we may be shorting some districts when we do it on a per capita basis and being overly generous to others in terms of what their real costs are. What I hear from my urban districts are, we have people who move here for more specialized special needs, so their costs are going to be higher. But then it can also be true that in a rural district, a family doesn't want to move, so they add some very expensive staff. But I think somehow we've got to be more scientific about how we're putting this money back out.
So I would say that based on the other states' models that we're going to look at tomorrow, nobody has anything like this. Because again, all states would have Medicaid reimbursement, and there are states have some leeway in what's allowed where and those kinds of things. But I've not seen any other state that has a formula that sets aside something for this. Now, this would be like what we would do is we would have a separate weighting for students that qualify for Medicaid services. And so if you look at the more of a student-based model, you would say, well, for every student that qualifies for a Medicaid eligible service, you get 0.03 of a weighting. That's how other states would do it when they're looking at student-based weightings. What we do, because we're starting with a set amount of money, is we just say, this is the amount that gets distributed under this formula every year. So I would not say that, I've not seen another state do it this way. And it actually makes it more confusing that we call it Medicaid replacement, because a lot of people think it's Medicaid funding, and it's not. It is state funding. But at one point, the legislature was making up for a change that the state made in how they, the eligibility for distributing Medicaid reimbursement, and said, okay, well, we're going to do this to set aside money within the state formula to make up for what they're losing in that. I mean, it was a state decision with state money, also based, I think, on a state decision about how they were reimbursing Medicaid eligible expenses, specifically around, I believe, attendant care.
Thank you.
Representative Steele.
Madam Chair, Dr. Harwood just answered my question, so thank you.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions. Frank, you spouted out a bunch of numbers there. You said 1.3 million on catastrophic aid, and I heard you say, I think 9 million on transportation. and I missed another number. I don't remember what it was.
It was 90 million on transportation,
That's different. Did you say one more number, though?
9 million on the Medicaid replacement. And so those come off of the top. So there are four, as Nick talked about, there are four categories. There's a set pot of money. The first three categories get funded first, and then special teacher reimbursement is whatever is left.
Okay, I think that's a little clearer. I've had a special interest in catastrophic aid, been kind of sidetracked with it, and I want to better understand. I asked one of my districts, Olathe, I appreciate our superintendent being here today on the first day of school, no less. Olathe spent last year on catastrophic aid $500,000, and yet they were only reimbursed $500,000. They were reimbursed $20,000. Help me understand the math of that, because that is not much reimbursement. I don't know who to ask that to. Maybe Nick?
So as my memo kind of points out, and the statute 723425 provides how that is calculated, but the calculation that's used in this statute is for that catastrophic state aid is it's 75% of any cost that exceeds twice the amount of the prior year's special teacher reimbursement entitlement. So
Go ahead and finish, Nick, and then we'll throw it to Dr.
I mean, that's the calculation that's used in statute. So that's how the reimbursement is conducted.
Dr. Harwood.
So there's one, it's that amount after you've subtracted out all federal and state funding you receive for that student.
Oh.
So when I get asked this question, to give a really rounded off level of doing that, special teacher reimbursement has been around $30,000. If you take away the funding that you get from the federal and the state for having that student in school, you're looking at about $100,000 of the district has to cover the first $100,000, and then they would get reimbursed for 75% of anything above that. So if you have a student that has expenses of $200,000, you'd receive $75,000 in reimbursement.
Okay, I got a little help from the audience. I missed a zero here, so let me correct myself. Olathe spent $500,000 on catastrophic aid last year and was reimbursed $200,000, not $20,000. So that makes a whole lot more sense to me. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before we go to the next memo? Seeing none, please proceed, Nick.
So, Madam Chair, just real quick, with regard to that Medicaid reimbursement state aid, that has been in statute since 2008, just a little history on it, has been in statute since 2008. The amount that's distributed, it's always been distributed with that $9 million amount per the Medicaid eligible student. The only change that happened in that statute was in 2010, when that statute was first enacted. That $9 million is only going to be distributed for certain school years, 2007-8 through the 2010 school year, but then in 2010, the legislature struck those years, those specific years, and just continued that $9 million Medicaid reimbursement from then on out. So 2008 was when it came in. It was at that $9 million amount then, and it's remained as such ever since then.
Thank you, Nick. And I would just say this may be one of those things where at the time it made sense, but are there better ways to use that $9 million and maybe not be so restrictive to better meet our students' needs? So we'll be examining that. Thank you, Nick. Senator Petty.
Just to follow up on that, but it is not an additional $9 million. It's just this is just a part of the formula of how that money, that $611 million is distributed, and that was added in 2008, then put in perpetuity in 2010. So it's not an additional $9,000. It's just a $9,000 out of that pot of money. Is that correct?
Yeah, special education state aid is appropriated as one special education services aid line item under the budget bill. And then, yes, that $9 million, it comes out of that total appropriation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Please proceed.
Okay, members of the task force, this second memo, it's titled Legislative History of the Statewide Excess Cost Formula and the Funding Rate that's in that statute that we just were discussing. So this is going over where this formula came from, where that 92% funding rate came from. So what I've found through my research is for as long as the state has provided special education state aid and has funded special education services using the reimbursement model that it does, the state has utilized this an excess cost calculation to determine the state aid that shall be appropriated for special education. And you can see on page 2, I found a graphic from a 1985 legislative post audit that's talking about the excess cost formula that was used back in the mid 80s and prior to that. And this was not a statutory thing. This was just what was used by the state to calculate excess cost and then base appropriations using that excess cost amount and determining appropriations to school districts. So not statutory. Then you can see on page 2 another audit, I think in 1998 audit, the Legislative Division of Post Audit is describing this excess cost formula that was used through the 90s, and you can see how that formula was done. Now, statutory-wise, for statute, this formula didn't get placed into statute until 2005. And in 2005, this is when the legislature was in the midst of the Montoy litigation, the Montoy v. State school finance litigation. So in Montoy, as you all are aware, I'm just going to kind of start at the very start of Montoy. Plaintiffs challenged the overall constitutionality of the school finance system, and they specifically made challenges to special education state aid funding. So in 2003, the Montoy District Court issued the first ruling in Montoy that got the Supreme Court involved afterwards. And the district court held the school finance system unconstitutional, and then they made some specific findings with regard to special education state aid. The district court found that the state further diminishes the availability of general education funds because the legislature only reimburses 85% of excess cost, which causes districts to transfer at least 15% of their general fund dollars to provide for special education. So that's a district court decision. That's what the Supreme Court was looking at. So in Montoy 2, when the Supreme Court looked at that district court decision, the Supreme Court said, yes, those findings are supported by substantial competent evidence, and the school finance system is unconstitutional. So that was what the legislature was working with, were those items, and I'm only speaking with regard to special education state aid here. So in the 2005 legislative session, the legislature took those rulings into account, and they revised the school finance formula and increased funding across the board, but also increased special education funding. And on page 3 of my memo, I want to direct you to those first bullet points. So with respect to special education funding, the legislature codified and put into statute the statewide excess cost formula that was being used by the state previous to this codification of the formula. And the legislature then, when they codified that formula, they enacted a statutory plan to increase special education state aid based on certain excess cost funding rates. So you can see in those bullet points, the plan was in school year 2005-06 to go to 85% excess cost, and then 88% in the next school year, and then 91% for each school year thereafter. So in Montoy 3, the Supreme Court evaluated the legislature's actions, and the Supreme Court found that the legislative actions fell short of providing constitutionally adequate funding. And you can see in that larger paragraph in the middle of page 3 what the Supreme Court noted. So after having a ruling of unconstitutionality again, the legislature responded to Montoy 3. And during the 2005 special legislative session, the legislature further increased special education state aid and other school funding amounts. And as part of this response, the legislature bumped up those reimbursement rates, those excess cost percentages. So for school year 2005 and 06, they bumped it up instead of 85%, they bumped it up to an 89.3% amount. And then for the 06-07 school year and each school year thereafter, they bumped it up to a 92% school or excess cost funding amount. So then in Montoy 4 decision, the Supreme Court approved the legislature school finance revisions and determined that the additional funding amounts brought the school finance system into constitutional compliance. And they noted the increases specifically to special education state aid and noted that there was an additional 111.5 million in new funding for special education being added. Then in the 2006 regular legislative session, the legislature then maintained that 92% rate in statute for each school year and has maintained that rate since then. So that's an overview of where that formula came from, where that percentage came from in response to Montoy. I do have on my bottom of page 4 of my memo, the excess cost formula has really remained the same in statute since it was enacted. In 2004, there was a slight change to how local option budget monies are calculated in that excess cost formula, and I'd be happy to get into that, but really it just separated the determination of regular education dollars and how they're determined from local option budgets and general fund monies, but not really a significant change to the excess cost formula that I'm aware of. And Madam Chair and members of the task force, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. We will start with Vice Chair Estes.
Nick, can you refresh my memory on a couple of things? What year did local option budgets come into existence?
I mean, certainly with the SDF QPA when it was enacted, but I don't know, I'd have to look back and see if there was any local, I mean, education has always been funded locally through local dollars, but I think the local option budget came along with the SDF QPA in 91, 92.
Okay, so that's, it kind of strikes me that when you look at your 1980s illustration on page 2, that, yeah, local option budget has been missing in, because it didn't exist at that time, and maybe that would have looked different if it had. Can you refresh my memory also on Gannon? You didn't refer to Gannon in here. Was special ed part of Gannon?
Yes, I do. I should have included that in this memo. Yes, the plaintiffs did argue special education funding in Gannon. Now, the Supreme Court, what my research has found, what our research has found, the Supreme Court, it was argued, and I recall in Gannon, I believe it was Gannon 4, the Supreme Court stated that the plaintiff's argument that the underfunding not meeting that 92% makes the formula structurally unsound. The Supreme Court did not take that argument and issue any big ruling on that. The Supreme Court instead said essentially that the structure is not rendered unsound for the school finance formula simply because special education isn't being funded at that statutory rate. Now, what the Supreme Court did say in that statement as well is that it can and certainly may factor into the overall adequacy of the school finance formula. And then they kind of left it at that. Then we didn't see much more regarding special education rulings from the Supreme Court in Gannon.
Okay, thank you.
But I've got a memo that kind of details what the Supreme Court has said.
And I seem to recall at the beginning of the session, you had a memo on the kind of a timeline of the lawsuits. If you wouldn't mind emailing that to me, I'd appreciate having that as well. Thank you.
I have a feeling there probably are other people on the task force who might like that as well. So if you could just send that out via to the email to all the task force members just for reference. Director Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nick, can we clarify the Gannon piece of this? Isn't it true that the reason the court did not accept the special ed arguments at the Gannon 4 phase is because in the original lawsuit brought, the plaintiffs actually did not, they didn't bring special ed into the original Gannon filing due to the fact that at that time the state was meeting the 92% threshold?
I'll have to look back. I do know, as I said, that there were arguments put forth by the plaintiffs regarding special education funding and the amount of special education funding, but I'll have to look back to see if those were put forth in the initial filings that led into the district court, the first decision in Gannon from the district court, or if those came in later. But I don't recall the Supreme Court denying those arguments because they weren't put forth in the first arguments by the plaintiffs.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for Nick and a question for Frank, if possible. One of the most common questions I get from my constituents when I talk about special ed funding is that if 92% is the law, why are we not doing it? Like, how do we get away with it? And I know a lot of things in our statute have like an asterisk that says subject to appropriation. Is this one of those scenarios?
Well, yes, so the law with regard to that 92% it's not an asterisk, it says subject to appropriation by the legislature. So it's in the law that is subject to appropriation by the legislature.
Okay, that helps with that, thank you. Frank, I think I have in my notes that in 2010, 2011 school year, that's the last time that we were doing 92%. Do you know how much the shortfall last year was from SGF to SPED, like statewide? How much was transferred?
Dr. Harwood.
So off the top of my head, I don't know the exact number. It's around $200 million. My guess is that KLRD is, I think on the agenda is the history of funding, so that specific number may be coming up later.
Okay, if I could follow up. My Olathe School District transferred 37 of that 200 million last year, which was a huge chunk out of the general fund. And I believe Blue Valley was like 16 million. Shawnee Mission was another 20. So just 3 districts that are really near me have been hugely impacted by this. And when I talk to them, they tell me this is blowing up their budget. It's not sustainable. So I really would like for us to really drill down and try to figure out how we can solve this issue to make things a little more predictable. So thanks for that clarification.
Dr. Harwood.
So if I could clarify one thing. So in 23-24, school districts transferred about $439 million from general fund or LOB into special education. So if the state would have been at 92% and had 200 million more in there, they still would have transferred in excess of $200 million. So one of the things we've trying to help people understand is that there's a misconception that if the state is supposed to fund 92% of excess costs, the districts would only have 8% of the costs. That doesn't work that way when you look at the excess cost formula, because one of the things you subtract out are the funds that the district gets because the student was already there as a general education student. So when you look back at the last time the state was at 92%, districts were paying about 25% of the costs of special education. So if you do the math the same way, if you subtract out what the state would have been at 92%, it kind of works out between 20 and 30% of special education costs based on the current law would be locally funded. And so that 92%, remember it's 92% of excess cost, it's not 92% of the cost. So when you take out some of those other parts, that's where the other, I guess, 18 to 28% comes from.
Representative Estes.
Dr. Harwood, thank you for that explanation, and I think some of what you're saying, all right, so, because yes, that student has other money, and part of what's happening in special ed is a lowering of student-teacher ratio, and that base funding that comes with that student is also making that happen. So that's one way to look at how to get what you're pointing out. Is that a way to think of it? And I know that wouldn't be the only way, but that would be one way.
So, I mean, the way I think about it is a special education student is a general education student first. And so the district received money because that student was there as a student regardless of their special needs. And so that money is counted. And then now we look at, so what did you need on top of that to provide the education, which is why you're now looking at the excess costs. And so the regular cost should have been covered by the regular funding formula. So we're looking at the excess cost. That's why I think you subtract that out. When you look at the way the calculation is done, you're counting the special education FTE of a student. So one student might be a 0.2 a 0.2 special education student because they just don't need very many services. And so the vast majority of the student's costs should be general ed. And so now we only look at that 20% being taken out of the excess cost because that's how they come out. So, I mean, for me, if you think about that, the special education student is first and foremost a general education student. You already received money for them being a general education student. We're just trying to look at the cost you have on top of that. And so it's kind of in the name, the excess cost formula.
It's almost a little bit misleading based on what you said. So, thank you.
Representative Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have, my colleague has discussed the Olathe schools, and I think it's important to note that in 2024, they had a 3.2 million special ed cash carryover. And so I do kind of want to look at these cash carryovers as well. When I talk to superintendents in my district, some of them voice concerns that this cash carryover is for the if scenario. They also carry over cash based on simply when they're getting disbursement from the state. So I guess my first question is, if it's a disbursement, is it a disbursement issue? And if it is, it's $3.2 million is still vastly too much to have in cash carryover. And so if we are discussing if situations, I would really like to have a further explanation of that. So I'm assuming that might be a Dr. Harwood question.
Dr. Harwood.
So I would say that a cash carryover in special education is for two reasons. One, you don't know what students you're going to get next year, so having some cash there. The other one is a cash flow issue. Secretary Prophet and I have already had the conversation about the cash flow issue, and if there's a fix for it, we decided we'd wait and see what happens here, because if we keep the same formula, then we probably do need to do something about that. The reason for the cash flow problem is that districts receive their last payment in June after all their expenses are done, and they don't receive their next payment until October, which is more than a quarter, the first quarter. So they have to carry over at least 25% to make it from the last payment to the first payment. And so if, I'm assuming Olathe has more than $10 million in special education expenses, probably, I mean, so $3 million in carryover does not seem outrageous. I think what we tell districts is you probably want to have between 25 and 30% cash balance in special education so that you can get from June until October. And so that's one of the conversations we have. Could we start paying sooner? It used to be no. The answer was no because the state didn't have the money. We couldn't start paying sooner because of the state's cash flow issues. That is not a problem at the moment, so we could start doing that. However, tomorrow when we start talking about non-reimbursement models, the reimbursement model means we have to pay after things are done. If you don't have a reimbursement model, you can pay on the front end based on what you expect to have happen. So I think some of those things could get fixed, but in the current model, if I had less than 30% cash balance in special education, I better have the cash someplace else because I won't be able to pay the bills in between.
Thank you for that information. Fed level, the federal government, I believe, is only paying approximately 13% of their 40%. Is that number still approximate?
I think it was 14 last year, but
Okay.
Yeah, it's close.
So has KSDE done anything to reach out regarding that, or are we just operating that we're just not going to get it?
So KSDE does not do a lot of political action things. I mean, so we remind about that. I think districts do a lot more with their federal delegation. I think the other part that's important to point out is that when the federal government instituted IDEA, they had a goal of 40%. It's not in law. But yes, I think we remind the federal delegation that they're short of what that is, but, I mean, KSDE provides information. We don't do a lot of political advocacy.
Representative Estes, and then McDonald.
Thank you. Dr. Harwood, the cash flow issue, I think we thought we fixed that for everybody with the change that we made. So I'd like more on why that's not working out for special ed. And if Director Profit wants to help you answer that from either one of you, or both of you, that's appreciated.
If I may, Madam Chair.
Director Profit.
So not to put words in Dr. Harwood's mouth, but I think he was talking about statewide cash flow issues, not necessarily at the district level. So historically, you know, not historically, the state does exceed revenues in the early part of the year. So we're heavy on expenses in the first 6 months and heavy on revenues in the last 6 months. Historically, that problem has been even worse because we had the delayed K-12 payment. So we made a previous year K-12 payment in the current fiscal year, and then we have debt payments on top of that. We've cleaned up our debt portfolio significantly. We've eliminated that delayed K-12 payment, but we're still out of balance revenues versus expenditures. We are in a position that we could pull forward those payments from a cash flow today. The question is, as we go across the long term, knowing that revenues are falling short of expenditures, will that be the case over the out years?
Okay, and that's very helpful to learn. When it comes, didn't we do a law last year that kind of fixed that calendar issue? Because we always use the accounting gimmick of showing something that we had.
Yes, that has been eliminated. That practice of delaying the final K-12 payment, it's now made in June. But the special ed payment, the first one, is still not made until October. I don't believe that's in statute. That's kind of at the request of KSDE. But yes, we did clean that up, the delayed K-12 payment.
So when we did that, we left out special ed on that.
I'll let Dr. Harwood jump in.
Dr. Harwood.
So the reason for not making a special education payment until October is that since we're working on a reimbursement, we calculate their payments based on the budget that's turned in September 20th. And so we don't know what they're budgeting until we get that budget in September. And then we turn around and say, okay, well, if they're going to spend all of this, this would be what their first payment would be. And so because our funding formula is based on reimbursement, we start with how many teachers are you going to have? I mean, that's how we do that. And we figure that out. We true that up in June based on what they actually turn in. So what I was saying is, and so we talked about, what Secretary Profit and I talked about, is that we could say, all right, we're going to pay in August 20% of what you got last year, and then we'll figure it out as we go along. We could do that. That has not always been possible because of the state's cash flow. It is now. After Secretary Profits and I's conversation, we said, well, do we want to make a change now for something that may only be 2 years and confuse everybody? Because if we move to because this has been the conversation of the committee or the task force, if we move to a student-based model, we would know much sooner what those are. We're not waiting for reimbursements. We're just looking at how many students and what are the situations. So when we do that, we could certainly change the way we do it. Again, right now, because we do reimbursement, we have to wait for the budget. We could guess, start a payment, and then true up later on. It's just a matter of, do you make that change now if there's going to be a change in 2027?
Thank you. Interesting things to talk about. It also makes tears make me look at tears as a benefit, because we know some students are more expensive than others. And I think it's better for the districts if we are much more accurate about how we're dispersing money than I think we are right now. So thank you.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A question for Nick. If the feds were to kick in magically and decide that they're going to do that 40% that they've had an aspirational goal for, that still wouldn't solve our problem of underfunding our SPED, right? We still wouldn't necessarily be up to the 92. The reason I ask, a lot of times when I have tried to advocate for fully funding special ed, which by definition we really mean 92%, people's response is, well, the feds don't do it. Well, I don't know how that, like, I can only impact what happens in this building. So is it true that even if the feds did do it, we'd still be in the same underfunding scenario?
So that, I mean, that would be a determination of the legislature in response to what the federal government is providing. I mean, that would be, I mean, the Fed, any Fed money that comes in is subtracted out of that excess cost formula, so it would reduce the excess cost amount. But what the legislature chooses to appropriate in future fiscal years, that's going to be a determination of the legislature. So I cannot speak to what would happen if the federal government started dispersing more money pursuant to IDEA under their goal of funding 40%.
Thank you.
I've seen runs, I can't give you the exact number, but I've seen runs that if the federal government did hit their goal of 40%, we would be over the 92% at the current level of state funding, but I'll have research verify that. So any other questions from the task force on that? Representative McDonald.
If we could get those runs, that would really help me. Thank you.
I have asked staff for those, but I have seen those, and it only makes sense if they're going to kick in another 27% of the funding, we would see a substantial increase in the coverage of excess costs from the federal government. I do want to ask, Nick, on your second memo, you give us a couple of graphics. The 2024 law that said now districts have to transfer their LOB sped money into their special education fund. Where does that show up in the formula?
So in the excess cost formula,
Yes.
that transfer is not specifically subtracted out of the formula. So that's not considered another funding source of special education state aid funding. So if you're speaking only of that transfer and how it's considered, maybe like if it would be considered like a federal funding source or another funding source for special education, that's not subtracted out of the excess cost formula.
It seems to me, and correct me legally, but what we're trying to do with the excess cost is get at the state's obligation for funding special education. Is that fair? I mean, that's why we subtract out what we already provide, because a special education student is first and foremost a regular. So we take that money out. We take out the money for special education that the federal government gives us, because that's not state obligation, right? We don't want to pay at the Fed and state level. Why don't we subtract out, or does it make sense to subtract out the local SPED LOB like we do the Fed SPED funding? Wouldn't that be more accurately reflect the state's obligation for that excess cost?
So, I mean, that's going to be a determination of the legislature of how they handle that local transfer of money. Certainly, it could be done, what you're suggesting, but again, that's going to be a determination of the legislature, and I can't speak to whether that is a good or a good idea or a bad idea. I can't speak to that.
I'd like to maybe have staff look at that, because as I looked at the graphic at the bottom of your memo, it's just dawning on me that may be a consideration, but that would be interesting. I'd like to see the impact if that were to be the case. That would be good. Superintendent Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can we go back up a little bit then on the LOB? You kind of went over the surface. You said, hey, I can go deeper into this, but so let's back us up. The LOB is local taxpayer funds, correct?
That is a local mill levy, yes.
So it seems the opposite if we're using it as a state fund, because local property taxes are mainly funding the LOB. Is that correct?
Yes, it is
Okay.
a local mill levy that's assessed by the local school district. Yes.
And in 2024, when the law changed, did the state contribute additional dollars to LOB, or was that just a change of now you need to take some money out of here and begin moving it over here?
The state aid formula with regard to the supplemental general state aid formula did not change in response to that. So the state aid formula stayed the same. The amount that is authorized to be assessed locally through the LOB stayed the same. It was just, the change was to transfer essentially an apportioned amount of the LOB that's related to the special education weighting.
Thank you. So it is local effort, is what I was getting to. So thank you.
So Nick, where does the state get its revenue from?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think you're probably getting at the 20 mil levy, I mean, or something like that, where for schools. That's I mean, that's a statewide mill levy that's pursuant to state statute. It used to be a local, counted as local aid, and now the state has counted it as, it gets ran through the formula as a state portion. But generally, it's, I mean, taxes on state citizens.
Are they the same citizens who pay local tax?
Yeah,
Are
correct.
they the same citizens that pay federal tax?
Yep.
Thank you. Representative Estes. Dr. Harwood.
I just want to make sure we point out that in the excess cost calculation, LOB is already considered. Because if you look on next page 2, C, factor in the regular education expenditures made from supplemental general fund. So you multiply the amount of the money that you get for the general education, and you multiply by that by the statewide percentage of LOB. So you're already subtracting out LOB. I don't know how you would subtract it out twice.
I'm not seeing that in the formula. Can you?
So that's in that
looking
first
at
memo
page-
in step 2, that table down there on page 2. So there is, previously the formula calculated general fund and local option budget dollars and determined regular education expenditures from that total general fund local option budget. The 2024 change switched that around, so you determine regular education dollars using general funds only, essentially, and then you have the thing that Dr. Harwood discussed. Then you factor in regular education dollars from the local option budgets by multiplying the statewide average percentage by the general education dollars that were going per pupil from the general fund.
Are
So-
you saying general fund, not special education fund? What am I missing?
Well, these are regular education. You're determining the amount of regular education
Right.
dollars that are attributable to the special education students. And so the formula essentially determines those regular education dollars from general funds and local option budgets. And it has from its inception, and then it still does today.
Does that include the special education LOB? In what you're
The
describing
special
now?
education transfer
Yes.
provision. I mean, to me, this is considering regular education dollars. I think what
Okay.
you're speaking on is a specific funding source for special education.
Correct.
Coming from the local option budget.
Correct. Is that currently being subtracted?
So it is not subtracted out like the other dedicated sources of funding, such as federal funds, Medicaid funds, and then contracts with state institutions. So it's not subtracted out from the formula in that manner
Okay.
that I'm aware of.
Okay.
It is. I mean, if you look at the calculation, you calculate the money that the district gets for the student being there as a general education student, multiplied by the base state aid, and then you take that amount times the statewide average of the LOB. So you're already subtracting out the LOB that the district receives because the student is a special education student in their district. And so then to try to count the mandatory transfer from LOB again would be double counting those funds, or at least a large portion of them.
Okay. I'm going to have to follow the math. I'm going to have to,
Yeah.
I'm going to
And-
put pen to paper and follow the math, because when I did it, when I had conversations, it didn't appear it was being taken out. But if it is, that's,
I mean, and so when we do the calculation for the consensus estimating group, it's general education and then it's LOB. Those are all in the line to get subtracted out right before you get to federal funds.
but it's not delineated as sped LOB. It's just,
No,
at this point.
it-
But it's included in that
But it would be-
calculation.
It would be LOB dollars that the district has because that student is a special education student in their district. Now, the confusion comes is that in 2024, now there's a mandatory transfer of funds that are not counted as state aid,
Right.
but some of that, or at least probably a good portion of that, is already being counted. So if you counted it again, it would be double counted.
Representative McDonald, while I think on that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was want to follow up on something Dr. Gibson said about LOB. Local boards are the ones that decide to raise these mill levies, right? or maybe it's a local election where voters decide. So that's pretty different than, you know, the legislature deciding we're going to have this income tax rate or this state sales tax rate. So to me, they're not the same. To me, LOB really has those roots from local decisions, and I think that that's a core tenet of Kansas. We always try to defer to local decisions when we can, and those are local dollars.
And I appreciate that, but the state is the one who gives the authority for the local districts to collect that money on behalf of the special education students. So I do think the state does have a vested interest. And I'm so glad, I guess I jumped the gun because apparently KLRD is going to have specifics that will hopefully help me understand how that LOB is rolled into that. So I appreciate that. Is there anything else for Nick on this information? Seeing none, thank you so much, Nick. Truly appreciate all of your work in this information. Okay, next we will have Matthew Willis with the Kansas Legislative Research Department giving us a review. Welcome back, Matthew.
Hi, good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the task force. So I will be starting, I have several things, but the first thing I'll be starting with is this white overview of special education services and funding in Kansas memo. This is one that I've presented before, so several of you are probably familiar with it. I have tried to expand it a little bit more than what it has been before, and I'll kind of touch on some highlights, and then some of the appendixes at the back, which hopefully will be helpful, I'll pull up on the screen and kind of walk through. So just to kind of recap a little bit, while Nick focused on the funding, I'm also going to kind of go into some of the kind of the policy elements or the service elements of special education. So as you're all aware, federally, special education is required with the enactment of the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There is also a Kansas state one that is the Special Education for Exceptional Children Act, or SECA, which largely mirrors the federal idea, but does have some additional elements to it. So first off, one that's pretty well known is that in Kansas, we require gifted services are required. Gifted students will have IEPs and are allowed or are required to have services just like any other students with other exceptionalities. As you can see in the memo, there's a variety of other ones regarding providing special education services to eligible students within the district to attend private school, requiring that they utilize interventions in regular education classrooms first, including post-secondary goals and transition services as part of their IEPs once they reach 14. Some others regarding kind of evaluation or due process. And then the two most recent are in 2023 House Bill 2322, changed the term emotional disturbance to emotional disability. That did not change anything about the exceptionality other than the term that is used within the state. Federally, it is still known as emotional disturbance, but any state documents will use emotional disability. And then also within the state, the SECA's definition of children with disabilities and individuals with disabilities, dyslexia is included explicitly as part of the definition for those. And so whenever we're talking about these, there is the federal, but state statute is also kind of at play here. Additional elements in regards to all of that, there's a reviser's memo that was provided to the 2022 Special Committee on Education. If you look at the PDF copy of this, there's a hyperlink to that memorandum that goes a lot more in depth into both the federal and state statutes. So then moving on to kind of the operationalization of it. So the state board under SECA is required to kind of administer the state plan and adopt some rules and regulations. And then the next part I'll get to that's one of the newer sections is discussing child find. And so child find's the term used for finding children with exceptionalities that would fall under this. While districts themselves primarily provide services for 3 to 21, each school district is required under KSDE rules and regulations to kind of be in charge of ensuring that there are policies and other elements regarding for child find from birth to 21. So districts are responsible for kind of ensuring some of those elements are there, even though they are not providing services for 0 through 3. I'm happy to go a little bit into further detail with what I have on that, if anyone's interested. Otherwise, I can kind of carry on to then how the services are provided. Okay.
Go ahead, please
All right.
proceed.
Perfect. So for under 3, those are provided by what are commonly referred to as tiny K programs. They're infant and toddler services. These are entities, there's 29 programs that serve the entire state. And they essentially act a lot like special education programs, but again, for 0 through 3. They're all going to be different. Several of them, or a lot of them, are tied to school districts or to service centers. Johnson County has the only one that is its own independent entity, but they are an element of it that are eligible and do receive some if they seek it, as well as are funded by the Children's Initiative Fund, State General Fund, and other federal funds. But they are providing the services until a child reaches 3, at which point when they reach 3, they then will transition to the school district providing services, where, again, it's going to be much as we've discussed and you're familiar with the school district having staff, IEPs, all of that element, and they can provide those services until the student either graduates, turns the age of 21, or withdraws from those services. The districts themselves, kind of moving on to from that, is the most districts kind of utilize one of 3 models, and that is where I'll go ahead real fast and start on here. Use kind of 3 delivery service models. I'm sure, let me bring that over. Is it this way? You know, I just needed to find the right screen. There we go. Sorry, it is a little small. Again, this is kind of tied to the back of the memo. I'm sure you're familiar with this map of mine I've had. So districts, the first one, and it's the one that you will see in school districts that are in white on this, those are school districts that independently provide the services. They hire all of their own teachers, special education teachers. They have all of the funding. They ensure that those services are provided to their students. For districts that do not provide it on their own, there are kind of 2 group models then that most of them utilize. One is a cooperative model, which is where one school district is the host that then becomes kind of in charge of all of that, and the other member districts will then transfer or provide them with the additional funding per whatever their cooperative agreement is to provide them the services as well. And then the final model is an interlocal, which is where several or however many school districts will essentially band together and create a third-party entity that the school districts govern through a board, and that entity is then the one that will hire the staff, have any additional facilities that's needed, and again will carry out providing those services to the member districts, and those member districts will provide them with the funding to do so, as well as they will then directly receive some others. This is important in part for kind of understanding the ecosphere of how exactly it's organized when you're looking at funding, but also when we get to some of my funding models in my slide presentation, I kind of break it out by these different entities, and so understanding kind of what they are and how they operate will kind of show some of those differences as well. In all instances, students are still receiving the services. It is much more the administrative of who and how is kind of governing and administering those. Following in the memo, I'll kind of gloss over. I have kind of step-by-step explanations of the excess cost formula we've discussed about and disbursement. I do go in a little bit in depth with catastrophic and Medicaid replacement, just kind of step-by-stepping out what is in statute. However, the next bit that I will get to here is probably much more what might be helpful. If I can zoom in. So on page, let me get here on page, I don't have page numbers on the appendices. So the bit after the map, I think it would be page like 12, is the excess cost formula example I've worked up. These are all very low numbers, an attempt to make sure that there is no realism to this. This is more of just trying to help visually walk through the step-by-step that Nick discussed to kind of understand how it works. So walking through this, so first, the first step would be determining the total amount of total weighted full-time equivalent students per KSDE's legal max. So we'll say that's 100 FTE. You then exclude a variety of weightings, special education, bilingual, transportation, at-risk, kind of the weightings that have specific purposes. That pretty much just leaves high and low enrollment by and large. So in this, we'll say that you exclude 30 of the 100 FTE, so you're left with 70. You would then multiply that by base state aid, which will be $25 for this example, which would get you 1,750. You divide that by the total number of FTE equivalent pupils on the count day on September 20th, and that gets you your funding per student. So we'll say that there were 15 there, so or at 50, and so it's $35 per. You then determine what is the total FTE enrollment for special education students, which is 15 for this example. You multiply them together, and that $525 would be then the kind of the general fund or the base funding that is provided to those students for being students in the school district. You would then take that amount and multiply it by the statewide average for LOB for determining what kind of that local, the local option budget element of that is as well, so $173, and add those together for that funding. You then figure out federal Medicaid reimbursements and the special education related services by state institutions, and you're going to add all of those together. So you have the 698, 120, so essentially $818 that are all of this kind of other funding that is considered not excess. Then you take the total amount of expenditures spent on special education, so $1,000. You subtract the 818 that's already there from it. That is what is determined by the statute formula as excess cost. You then take 92% of that, and that's where you get what would be the 92% of excess cost for the state to fund. I don't know if this helps with the earlier, but I'm happy to kind of pause here for some questions on how that works.
What questions do we have for Matthew? Yes, Director Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Matthew, because this is like a simplified way of following along, the $818 is, in this example, the amount of the baseline that is subtracted, all of that 818 is subtracted out. The excess cost that needs additional special ed funding is the remainder, right?
Correct. So you would take the 1,000 minus 818, which gets you 182, and then you take 92% of that to determine. So the 182 is the excess cost, and then you would take 92% of that for what per statute would be the state's portion of funding.
Follow up. Okay, so to go back up to what is step 6 in this table, that is where the amount of LOB generated by the number of special ed students in this example is accounted for in the, right? Like it's the LOB in this example, the average, the percent is 33%. And the multiplication problem that precedes it has accounted for the portion, the percentage of that district's LOB that they did generate by the enrollment of those students classified as special ed?
Yes, if I'm following. So yes, so that is, so you're taking essentially the amount that those students have generated, not accounting for any additional weightings, bilingual transportation. So what they've generated and taking that by the statewide average of what the LOB percentage is. So yes, that would account for what their local option budget is generating. Again, it is accounted for as what the statewide average is. I use 33 since that is the hard cap in statute, but each district does vary.
Well, and to complete the transaction, the 2024 law stipulates, as I understand it, that $173 generated for that by the LOB, that is the portion that must be transferred into the special ed fund?
Yes and no. So the 2024s, it requires that they transfer a portion of LOB that is equivalent to kind of the proportion of their weighted special ed FTE. So if a district has 1,000 FTE and 100 of them, if 10% of it is from special education, then they should be transferring 10% of that LOB to special education. And so it doesn't necessarily, and Jenny will kind of touch on it too, when you get into LOB calculations as well, there's the possibility of using a different number for special education. And so it's stating kind of a way of calculating an amount that they must transfer. But I, at least personally, I think I'd be hard to tie it, because while the calculation of it is tied to the proportion that is their special education weighted FTE, it is still all just local option budget. And so depending on what those students are getting out of general, I mean, you could argue that, like, is that equivalent to what the amount of LOB that they generate as a general ed student? Are there other elements? Like, I think it's kind of the difference of equation of here is seeking to see what is the LOB that they are generating using that percentage, and the other one is creating a transfer number using just a proportionality of the weighted FTE to their total weight, their SPED weighted FTE to their total FTE.
But the fact remains that the percentage of the LOB generated due to the existence of those students, those FTEs with an IEP, is accounted for in the total amount of funding that is used as what you remove to get to the excess cost number.
Madam Chair, Director Worker, yes, it accounts for local option budget, but whether the local option budget accounted for in the excess cost formula and the amount required to be transferred might not necessarily be the same number.
Got it. Thank you.
So it begs the question that I think I was trying to get at earlier, is which one is more accurate for determining the state obligation for excess cost?
Madam Chair, I do not believe I could ask, or I do not believe I can answer that question. I think that is more an element of a policy decision.
Dr. Harwood.
So that might be a better question for Nick, but according to the current law, it's the portion that is part of this calculation that you just talked about. The mandatory transfer, according to current law, is not considered state aid. I mean, so based on current law, one is and one isn't.
If nothing else, I think that this illustrates perfectly the reason why we want to try to simplify it and make it easier to understand, because it is very complicated. And we just want to make sure that we are maximizing resources and getting them to help the most kids in the most productive way. So, okay, any other questions for Matthew at this point? Seeing none, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So moving on, then the next one, which will look, if I can get this to just, that will look very similar, is it's a similar kind of table. It's just going to handle the distribution side of things. I will note that this one does not include the KSDE, the state board's distribution. I will pull up something and talk about that, but this This example, again, using very silly numbers, is for what is in statute as far as kind of the four elements that Nick kind of discussed previously. So again, for this example, we'll say that $167 is special education state aid. And so you would, I guess this does kind of include, so the first thing that you would do is determine and subtract the amount of special education state aid that is in excess of the statutory threshold to be dispersed by the Board of Education. So we'll say that that threshold was 150, so you're going to take $17 and send over for the state board's formula to distribute. You would then, utilizing what was laid out in law with the $9 million, subtract Medicaid replacement state aid to be distributed via the number of Medicaid students. And so we'll take $3 off the top of that, so we're down to 147 of the state appropriation. You then would subtract out catastrophic aid, again calculated as Nick discussed. So we'll say that that's another $4. And then you get to transportation. So you're going to subtract out mileage amounts. You'll subtract out expenses incurred for providing transportation to special education students and expenses for the maintenance of special education students in out-of-home placement. So again, you'll see 7, 7, and 1. So we're down to $128 after kind of doing these different elements that kind of take an amount just off the top of special education state aid. Then you get to the final element, which is that categorical, the teacher aid, which is the bulk of it that we talk about, where you're going to first then need to determine the statewide FTE for special education teachers. I would note in this calculation, a licensed special education teacher equals 1 FTE, a special education para equals 2/5 of an FTE. And so we'll say we added them all up, and that equals 50 total FTE between special education teachers and paras. You would then take the $128 left and divide it by 50, and then each school district would get $2.56 per special education FTE that district has. And then you'll see in the far right-hand column, I kind of have two just District 1 and District 2, where I just kind of threw in numbers to, again, kind of get this idea of how it works. So in the final bit of it that is kind of the largest, that is where it is going out to districts based on the number of teachers they have. So a district with that hires a few teachers is not going to get as much of that final bit of aid as a district that has more special education staff. Again, this is where, and this is where, though, too, where it can get a little nuanced, given that with interlocals and cooperatives, you have staff who are serving schools, that those schools are not technically the ones employing them, and so that will also have to get kind of divvied up and taken into account when distributing the aid. And so that is, again, kind of an example. And then to discuss really fast the state board's method, the state board has chose to do a local contribution method. Okay. Never mind. I can distribute the PDF. I'm not sure why it's blanking on me. But essentially, the state board just chose a method where for each district, they would see what was the district's total expenses, and then they would subtract out the state aid that the district got, the federal aid, a bunch of kind of the resources and aid they would have already had to try and figure out how much local dollars did that school board contribute to special education. And then they aggregate all of that and then figure out what percentage a school district had of the overall local effort. So if when I was looking at it, like I think I won't call any names, I don't remember offhand, but so if a school district had 5% of the total state local effort of kind of additional, then they would get 5% of whatever the amount is that the state board is distributing using this model. So they get 5% of whatever the appropriation is above 528 million. I believe for this last year it was 73. So you would take 73 million times 5%, and that's the additional aid that they would get through that formula. And then, sorry, the double screens. And so I will pause there for kind of further questions on the funding element. Otherwise, I am, oh, can you share my screen again? Otherwise, I can jump on. I have one last kind of graphic that's in the back of the memo that is cash flow that I can get to if there are no further questions on kind of the current distribution models.
Let's take some questions. Are there questions on the current distribution model for Matthew? Seeing none, you can proceed.
Perfect. So the last thing, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to kind of some of the discussions of cash flow, this final one that's at the very back of that memo does seek to kind of help show both the cycle of the funding as well as the payments. So you can see the different boxes that are in orange are discussing kind of the funding calculations or when throughout the year is going to be an element of kind of helping estimating or determining the funding a school district would get. And then the green ones are highlighting their payments. So as has been discussed, the first one goes out in October, within December, March, and April, and then the final one being in June. So again, I can happy to talk about that, or I will jump into then my slide deck where we'll kind of dive into some numbers of special education students in Kansas, kind of national comparisons, funding, things like that. More colorful pictures.
We have a question, Representative McDonald.
Can you, and this may be a frank question, when is like the collective bargaining with teachers about salaries and stuff on this, in the timeline?
Dr. Harwood.
So I would say you have to make notice of the intent to negotiate at the end of January. Most districts try to have it finished up by early summer. Some of them go into the next year. So I would say somewhere between January and December.
Have you ever thought about running for office, Dr. Harwood? I'm just wondering.
I mean, so part of this is just looking at how a school district budget works. You don't know what your total dollar amount for the year is until the 12th month of the budget. At the same time, you are making projections for student needs, which means you're making projections for teacher needs, and you're doing that in the spring while you're negotiating how much you're going to pay the teachers. And then in the fall, you start to figure out how much you're actually going to have, resources you're going to have to cover the expenses that you've agreed to the previous spring. And so this again illustrates why cash balances are important, because if you make an error, it can be really bad.
Yes, Representative McDonald.
Thank you. I don't know if that was helpful or not, but it was insightful. One thing that superintendents have talked to me about is how they really hope we could have like a buffer period, because I know we will make changes to the formula, but having some consistency and knowing what to expect. I don't know if it would be like a year's warning or ramping up to something. To me, that's a pretty important thing. I'm jumping around here, but this is a calendar. I think that would really help them to be able to prepare for staffing and negotiating good faith for salaries. Thank you.
It's Dr. Harwood.
And I'll just say that is something that I will be bringing up when we get to the end, because we're looking at the current formula expires on June 30th of 2027. If the replacement formula isn't done until May of 2027, I will certainly be advocating that the task force looks at something to phase that in, whether it's extending the current formula for one more year, but it would be very difficult for districts to learn what the formula is in May to implement in July. And so that's just something we have to think about as we move forward. The bigger the change, the more time you need to react to it. If it's really small changes, that's one thing. Big changes, I think we just have to think about I think that's also true for the state in that when you start looking at, especially if we come up with something that costs more, the state may want another year to plan for it. And so all of those things are, I have to be in there. So I was going to be bringing that part up at some point. We just weren't ready for it yet.
Yes, Dr. Nineswonder.
Since we have this calendar and there's only a few people in here that have gray hair to remember, when you look at the green payment dates, and I'm sure research has this, but that June green payment used to be July. And back when I was a superintendent, the state moved collections from July to June to help the state make payments. So when we would receive our payments in June, as Dr. Harwood said, it's right at the end of the fiscal year, but we used to receive it the next month, which was right at the beginning of the fiscal year. So just because the fiscal year ends on June 30th and starts July 1, when you take that pot of money and move it 30 days earlier, now we go from June to October, instead of starting the year knowing we're getting a payment here in 20 days. And then it ended up, oh, we got it 20 days earlier, so we've got to use it till October. So it was nice starting a fiscal year knowing in 20 days we were going to get money from the county. So that payment just moved 1 month, but it happened to come in the prior fiscal year instead of, I get a bunch of revenue here in 20 days when I start the fiscal year. And that was back in 2005, 2000, something like that. So we've been living on getting money right at the end of the year, so we got to carry it into the next year when we used to get it right at the start of the year. So that was a big change.
Director Ricker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, not to put you on the spot, Dr. Harwood, but if memory serves, when we were mired in like the 2016 special session that ran into June before we had completed our business specific to school finance, 2017 session ran close to all those deadlines. I feel like at the time there was a date certain in mid-May that districts are required to notify their staff of whether or not that staff member will be employed by the district in the next school year. Is that still a thing that is required? Is that?
So yes, I mean, so teachers have what's called continuing contract. So that means, and I think the date is now moved back to June, like the first something in June. Somebody can help me out with that. So it did get moved back, but after that date, basically you can no longer non-renew the contract. At that point, you have to cancel it, which is, then you need to cause and those kinds of things. And then the teachers have 3 weeks after that. And if they don't notify the district that they are not coming back, then continuing contract, they would have to be allowed to leave the contract. So those are still in place. During that time, those dates got moved back, but they're still there.
Representative Getz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Matthew, for your presentation. I have a question around how money is distributed for the equalization on top of the bulk of special ed, but the equalization money that the state board has set, how that goes out. Once it hits a district, are there rules that if they're part of a interlocal or cooperative, that needs to get transferred immediately? Can they hold on to that and pay assessments with it, do things that are related to special ed but are not going directly to those services quite yet? I'm just getting reports that some of that is getting held in transit, and it's causing some confusion of what is the authority there for them to hold that at the district level, since it's going to the district, but they're a part of an interlocal or a cooperative? What are the rules behind that? And it might be a department question as well.
Yeah, so, Madam Chair, Representative, my understanding is all of that, those elements of what and how much and when funds are transferred between districts and either their co-op or interlocal is going to be kind of organizationally decided. So like that interlocal is going to have policies of setting what is the assessment, how much or what needs to flow through of special education aid, things like that. There's nothing that I'm aware of in state law, so Dr. Harwood probably has some further insights, but I think that would be more of a organizational decision.
Dr. Harwood?
Yeah, I think so. It's important to remember when the legislature approved the funding, the $73 million that was not to go through the categorical aid formula, what the stated intent was. And so at that time, the intent was to reduce the reliance of local funding for special education purposes. So to go back to the kind of the two types of state aid, special education state aid that were set up, what's calculated through the categorical aid formula, those are reimbursements, so they go to whoever has the expense. So a lot of cases, transportation goes to the district because the district had the transportation expense. The staffing typically goes to the co-op or interlocal, if there's one, because they employ the person. There's some variance in there. At some point, the legislature said, as opposed to sending those dollars directly to the co-op or interlocal, we're going to send those to the school district first, because that would let them raise their general fund in order to be able to assess locally a higher LOB. There was never any intention that those dollars would then become state special education dollars. It was the ability for the local school board to have access to more local dollars. Those dollars then are called flow-through, and they go to the co-op or interlocal, and then there's a schedule for that. So the way the co-op or interlocal budgets are usually set, that group decides what their expenses are. They subtract out the flow-through, and because they employ the people, they're actually the ones that are telling the district what the flow-through will be. All of those entities have a distribution model that says, a lot of them are based on either enrollment or special ed enrollment, based on you get certain percentage of this, and then that goes to your general fund, and then you turn it back in. And those payments, they're expected to do that when those payments come in. For the local contribution model, once we get last year's expenses in October, then we put together basically what percentage of the local contribution each district have. And in November, we notify the districts about what their local contribution amount will be. And that amount goes directly to the district in January. There is no requirement that that be sent on to the co-op or interlocal. However, it is special education aid. It has to go into Fund 30. Based on when I talked about the cooperative or local sets their budget, subtracts out the flow-through, the rest of those expenses become assessments to the district. So they'll say each district needs to pay this amount of money based on that percentage. My understanding of the legislature's intent was that that local contribution funding could be used to decrease the need to transfer from general fund or LOB to make those assessment payments. So the money was going to end up with the co-op and interlocal because it's special education money. You can't spend it on anything else. The hope was that it would reduce the amount that they needed to transfer from general funders or LOB. So there was never intention that all of that money flowed straight through to the co-op or interlocal. Some of it was going to have to, especially now that no additional money goes into categorical aid. The flow through is getting to be a smaller portion, and so assessments are going up, and then districts are using the local contribution to help pay their assessments. But it can only be spent on special education expenses.
Madam Chair, thank you. I do think this I mean, for me, this is just another reason to get closer to an upfront amount rather than a reimbursement amount, because even in that and trying to equalize this, you know, I think they felt like they were going to get that at the interlocal and the cooperatives, and, you know, some of that's communication level, and then they're just getting it through assessments that they were already going to get. So it's not getting their base, but just getting the extra. And it's causing some confusion and hardship in the financial realm of some of our interlocals and cooperatives. So just something we need to look at, and maybe that percentages and tiered system might be an exciting thing to look at in the next couple days. So thank you for those answers.
We have Representative McDonald, then Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just real quick, back to Frank's. Oh, Frank, did you want to respond before I change the subject again?
We're going to go ahead and
Okay.
keep moving here. And
I love that I can learn new things in this job every day. I would love to get something from the Department of Ed that spells out a little bit of that paragraph you said about how teachers have a continuing contract, and if this, then that, and the dates. That would help me a lot.
Representative Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Go back quickly to the Medicaid monies. That does fall under Fund 30 for local districts, the SPUD funding. The Medicaid, extra Medicaid money does go to their Fund 30.
So they would receive it as part of their special education state aid that would go into their general fund, and those required to be transferred into Code 30, yes.
Okay, thank you.
But I will tell you, in Code 30, it doesn't show up as Medicaid reimbursement.
Correct, it's the SPED. I just wanted to make sure that in my brain that I was tracking all of that. Okay, so you made mention earlier that you had talked to Mr. Profit about potentially what does it look like to send out monies differently now that our state is doing better financially. So what would that potentially change on this with what Matthew has presented?
So what it would do is that we could make a payment between July and September. It would not be, it would be an estimate of what we think your reimbursement might be. So what we talked about, what I would propose is a percentage of what you got last year. So if we're going to pay it out in 6 payments, we're just going to send you 1/6 of last year's. And then when we actually get the right amounts, we'll adjust going forward, and then you true it up all at the end. So that's what we talked about as a way to even out the payments throughout the year, but we won't have any current year data to make those estimates on. We would just have to do it based on something from last year, which I don't think would be a problem.
Is that something that requires State Board of Education approval, or something that your agency can do?
I would have to look at, we'd actually have to have permission from the Department of Administration, because that would be a pretty good chunk of, I have to look and see where the State Board does that or not. But again, I think, well, when we see some of the other conversations this week or tomorrow, kind of like this, making that change for one more year, just depending on whether that's the right thing to do. I mean, I will say that districts are used to the system we have. Changing the system now and then turn around and changing it right again, I'm just not sure how valuable that is to solve the problem of if people think cash balances are too high.
That's understandable. What I hear from my districts is special education and funding, and they're always struggling, would be a good word. So if they were able to get a little more upfront, I think that might be something that could be helpful, regardless if it's for 1 year or not. But it would be a step in the right direction, I would think. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Estes.
Thank you, and thank you for the previous question, because I'm sitting here thinking about it, and I'm like, okay, well, if we switch away from a reimbursement model that's causing everybody a lot of pain, and we get to where we know what we want to spend per child up front, couldn't we be much more early and much more accurate with districts by switching to a student-funded model?
Do you care to
Yes.
comment, Dr. Harwood?
Yeah, I was waiting to be acknowledged. So yes, I mean, I think that if we want to do something before October, we may still need to estimate because, so if we do a student-based model and it's still based on a September 20th count, we're not going to know until October 10th when they turn those things in. But again, we could also say, well, last year, this is what you had, let's start paying on that. I mean, that actually is less of an issue for KSDE and more of a change in where the state's cash flow is and making sure that works out for that. Again, it's not ideal. Districts are kind of used to it, but I think it's something that can certainly be addressed.
Because I think it's just a way to save districts a lot more pain. We can take where you were last year and then in October adjust and you're done for the entire year. And it just seems like there's a simpler, better way to do it. But I see you have something to add, so.
So except that the numbers we get in October 10th for September 20th get audited through the year. And so it changes, but
Yes.
it changes based on the students you have, which the districts know. The current reimbursement model, you don't find out until late May what the special teacher reimbursement model amount is going to be, because it's dependent on how many people everybody else hired and how much their transportation costs were. So that's the, I mean, so we would still audit, and so you could lose because the student didn't count. That's different than, I think I know what I'm going to get for each of the FTE, and we'll see what it is come basically the 12th month of the year. So it's different, but you wouldn't know exactly what it is on October 10th.
But we have a better idea than we've got now. So that would be progress. Thank you.
Senator Petty.
I just want to, a clarification when it comes to, because it was mentioned about the Medicaid funding. So when it comes to the distribution, we're just talking, that's talking about that $9 million. I mean, what KDHE is providing for students for any student that is Medicaid eligible, that's not in here at all.
Madam Chair, Senator, you are correct. So if a district is getting actual Medicaid dollars as reimbursement, that is still going into Fund 30, but it's a different line and they'd be getting it from KDHE. This is talking about the replacement funding.
Okay, thank you. Just want to clarify.
Any other questions before we move on? Seeing none, Matthew, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was asked if we could provide more pictures. So this slideshow is largely a bunch of visualizations to hopefully kind of help just look at some things in some slightly different ways. So I kind of have three kind of main tiers. So we're going to start off with just the IDEA and gifted students in Kansas, and then I'll kind of move to a few slides on special education staffing, and then we'll end up with some that kind of deal with some high-level finances. So starting off, and you should all have a printed copy of the slideshow as well. I tried to pick colors that hopefully would contrast well with this lovely blue background our KLRD slides have, but I apologize if some of them are hard to read. So starting off with, you'll see that on the left-hand pie chart is just showing the amount of IDEA and gifted students compared to kind of regular education students or non-IDEA and gifted students. So you'll see we have about 93,000 IDEA and gifted, and then about 384,000, and this is head count, not FTE, 384,000 who do not receive any kind of special education service. And then of that 92, almost 93,000, about 10,400 are gifted students, and 82,375 are IDEA students. Moving on, so this is going to show, and anytime you're seeing school year, that's just think of it as the end of it. So like where it says SY school year 2015, that's the 14-15 school year. I just used kind of the end date. So this one's just showing you kind of the trend. The yellow bar is IDEA student enrollment from 15 through last school year. The blue is gifted, and then that kind of burgundy or purplish line is the all student enrollment. So you'll see that in general, while total enrollment in public schools across the state has been declining in kind of the last 10 or 11 years, IDEA specifically has been growing, as gifted it has also been kind of declining a little bit. I think in 15, there were 13,608 gifted students, and in 25, there was 10,401. So, and then this is a map that I copied off of the NCES website. It's a little hard to read up here on the screen, but it basically just shows the percentage of public school enrollment by state that is 3 to 21 receiving IDEA services. So this would not include gifted, since while Kansas requires it in the same level, a lot of states do not. So you'll see that Kansas is, kind of not really out of the norm. Both Nebraska and Oklahoma both have about 17% as well. I will note this is the 22-23 school year. That's the most up-to-date NCES has. On the low end, you have the Virgin Islands that are at 9%. Hawaii and Idaho are both at 12%. And then on the high end, you have Maine, New York, and Pennsylvania with around 21% of students, and Massachusetts with 20%.
Matthew, if you could just pause for a moment. I'm going to ask, please silence your phones and make sure that they are not going off during committee. It's disruptive, and I'd appreciate if everyone would just check your phone. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Please continue.
And so then moving on, so this is kind of breaking down the totals by exceptionality. I have both the table and then the pie chart. For the pie chart, orthopedic impairment, visual impairment, traumatic brain injury, and deaf blindness are not on the pie chart because they're under 0.5%. And so I just, since they would have rounded to 0, I just removed them for clutter purposes. But they are in the table on the left, so you can see, deaf blind, the head count is, for this last year, was 26 students, as opposed to specific learning disability that had 28,000. And then all of the percentages are a percentage of the total IDEA and gifted. So for instance, specific learning disability is 30.27% of that 92,000, almost 93,000. And then gifted makes up about just over 11% of our special education population. And then I'll do these next couple and then can pause in case there's some questions before I get too far along. So this one is, again, just showing a trend line with some line graphs. This is for all of the exceptionalities that have more than 2,000 head count. Trying to fit all of them. The ones at the bottom just got smushed. So the next slide will show anything that's under 1,000, which is the rest of them. But again, you can kind of see that there's a few that are going up. There's quite a few of them that are kind of plateaued. Though again, I'll note with everything going up, even if you see a percentage that has stayed stable, likely it has had at least some small increase due to just the overall growth in the category. And then we have the one that again is under 1,000, so you can get a better idea of some of those rarer or just not as populated exceptionalities. And then finally, this is a table that just again gives you the percent. So it just turns the line graph into percentages to try and help make it a little easier to read on seeing trends. So I can pause here for a moment in case there's questions. I apologize not pausing earlier.
A lot of really good information. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This might be for Frank. I remember when my son was in elementary school, he has a diagnosis of autism, but until like age 8 or 9, we put it under developmentally delayed. Is that standard practice? Is this autism number maybe underrepresented when we split up categories? looks like it's a Bert question.
Yes, actually, when we do eligibility, we can define the child as being eligible as developmentally delayed between the ages of 3 and 9. By age 10, they must be evaluated, and either they're exited from special education or they're placed into a category of disability. It's an IEP team evaluation staffing team decision. Oftentimes at 3 years old, children can have communication or behavior delays. You don't know for sure if it's autism. You may have a parent bring in something from a physician that would have to be considered as part of the decision. But developmentally delayed, only a few states are using it. We went to it, gosh, years and years ago, and we've been using it ever since. That's why you see the numbers on here being so high for developmentally delayed, because it does cover students through age 9.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you say other states don't do it this way. Do you have any insight, or could you give us later some insight on if we didn't do it this way, what way should we do it? And would it make a difference, right?
The only difference it would make is many parents, to tell them that their 3-year-old is emotionally disabled or that the 3-year-old's autistic, you can have parents that react to that in a manner that says, but this child hasn't had experiences. So we want them to have the normal experiences through the IEP process under developmental delay, so that at some point, we don't have to wait till age 10. We can define the child as eligible under a disability category. We found that to be very beneficial for parents who are resistant to put children into services early on because a label is being placed on their child. We want to have the evidence and be sure that the eligibility is determined correctly when we are categorizing a student with a disability, especially a significant disability.
And then my last question, if you would, under other health impairments, I've had a lot of foster parents come to me talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and I have a bill that I'm working on resubmitting this year to see if we could articulate that somewhere within our documents. Historically, with kids who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, are they put generally under the other health impairments? Do you think it would be helpful to spell that out like we do with dyslexia?
It's a very interesting process. Under other health impairment, you have certain conditions that have to be met. It has to be a chronic condition. It has to meet certain eligibility criteria. And so we do look at a variety of medical and mental health issues when we're looking at the possibility or potential to identify a child as meeting other health impairment. So fetal alcohol syndrome may be one of the background information that we receive, but we have to look at how it impacts that child's ability to relate in the environment and determine that they have eligibility and a need, because both prongs must be made before we can determine the child meets eligibility and has the need for special education or specially designed instruction.
Okay, so they probably would go under that other health impairment, though?
It's entirely possible, but that's the IEP team, or I should say the eligibility team's determination to see if they have enough data that would support that the child would meet other health impairment under that condition.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful.
Vice Chair Estes.
Thank you, Bert. I want to get some clarity on some of your answers to Representative McDonald. Are you saying that under current policy, we don't define someone as autistic until they're 9 years old?
I should have clarified that. At age 3, we can identify a child under any category of disability. So we can identify a 3-year-old as autistic, emotionally disabled. That's a decision of the staffing team. Once they have the evaluation completed, they look at all the data, they make that determination. Many school districts that I have worked with look at developmental delay to give that child an opportunity to participate in an environment of school or preschool, and then make the determination after that child has matured somewhat to see if it truly was a developmental delay or if it translates into a category of disability. So you can, any of the 13 categories of disability can identify a child from 3 through age 21.
Okay, is it practice then to wait to the night? You're saying you want to give time, or how long does it go?
It's an IEP team decision. Once the child meets the criteria of eligibility, then any data in a reevaluation or upon parent request or school request, that child can be looked at and redetermined to either be exited or meet a different category of eligibility or have other categories of eligibility added on, because we do have students with primary disabilities and secondary disabilities.
Correct. I mean, just from the way that you answered Representative McDonald, I reacted because it sounded like we're waiting till 9, and very clearly we have kids who walk in the door, and we know that we need that early intervention is critical. So I appreciate the clarification. It's what I wanted to hear, but it does also relate to gifted. And I remember being told, oh, we won't even test for that until 3rd grade. Is that still the policy of most districts around the state?
I would say at age 8, when there's normalization among the school population, where you truly can see if that child was stimulated at an early age or if they truly have a giftedness because they have to score within academia, either ELA or math or some area of content that they have to be at the 95th percentile, and then they need to have an intelligence quotient at 130 or above in most agencies. However, some can set that criteria higher and have. So at the local level, they can determine what that's going to be. If you truly have, like I did when I was in Mulvane, have a kindergartner that was reading on the 4th grade level, he was identified for gifted. So I'm saying that it's a local decision. When you feel that the child meets criteria to be a child with giftedness, then that IEP team makes that decision, the eligibility team. But normally you wait till age 8.
I'm going to share with you that was the complete opposite of my experience as a parent, that my child their reading level was checked before they went to kindergarten. She was reading at a 4th grade level, and they said, we just absolutely do not test until 3rd grade. And the same concern that I have for a student that we know has an exceptionality like autism, and knowing to intervene early is important. And I think we have a whole lot of gifted kids in Kansas who aren't getting tested early enough. And I don't know how we work to communicate this better, because by the time it was agreed that we would test my daughter, they looked back and they said, oh, all of her scores are so high, we don't even have to wait. So why aren't districts picking that up sooner? And that's a little bit beyond what the conversation we're having here, but I really do have a heart for all of our students, and I'm a little concerned when we say, well, we want to wait and see how they are in school and not trust parents a bit more. And certainly I see Dr. Harwood has his hand up. So,
Yes, Dr. Harwood.
I just want to make sure we clarify for the developmental delay, if that is the what the IEP or the team decides, that student is getting services. And so they are being served, and you're just looking at keeping the door open for what specialized services they have. So if you suspect autism, you might, I mean, they could be getting the same services as a student that was categorized as autistic. You just wait to make sure that's what you want that to be. That's different with gifted. If you don't have the IEP, then you don't have the IEP. But with developmental delay, it doesn't mean they're not receiving the services they need. It just means that you haven't settled on what you think the primary diagnosis would be.
And I think my point is, I hope we would do the same for the gifted children, because I think we're letting them fall through the cracks, and some of them become behavior problems as a result of that.
Representative Steele, then McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the multiple disabilities, so if a student has a TBI and they're visually impaired due to the TBI, are we just still categorize that as TBI, or would that be under the multiple?
I hate to say this, but that's up to the eligibility team to decide, because everything is individualized. So they would have to determine if this child needs vision services as the primary disability, then they would be put under vision, but they would have a secondary disability of TBI. Could be the opposite. The TBI could be how they want to look at primary disability. It doesn't change the services. It's the way that they identify the child with a primary and secondary disability, but the services will be to meet the vision delay and also to support the traumatic brain injury.
With the specific learning disability, would that be what specific things? That's the largest category. So do we have that list somewhere of what, I just don't remember, is that falls under, oh, perfect. Yes, then there you go.
If I may interject,
Matthew.
Madam Chair, Task Force, in your folders, there should be a fairly thick handout a little ways back that is the eligibility indicators. So it's a fairly lengthy document that kind of details a lot of what to consider when looking for different exceptionalities.
And then my last question is, with IDEA and the state law, are any of these things, I know that the table is titled IDEA and gifted, but these are aligned with federal level IDEA. Kansas has not added anything except for gifted.
At this point in time, gifted and dyslexia, however, dyslexia falls under a learning disability because that is how it's defined. It is defined in the law as being a disability that the child has that creates problems with learning. And so we have asked our systems to identify dyslexia, and that's why you see these numbers going up. So dyslexia is now being identified under learning disability. So we have that under the category. So because the state decided 2 areas, gifted and dyslexia, however, dyslexia does fit under learning disability, and for reporting purposes to the feds, we place them under that so that we can get the funding that comes with it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a real quick clarification. Sorry for the rabbit hole, but I just kind of wanted to make the point that our autism number here is very likely underrepresenting how many kids we have with autism in our Kansas schools. And I wanted to reiterate what Representative Estes said. I had a similar experience and hold the same view. Thank you.
Okay, Matthew, I would like to go back to the chart that shows the public school enrollment for IDEA and gifted students for the school years 2015 through 2025. I've seen similar statistics that show we have an increase in our special education population while our general head count is declining. To what is that attributable?
Madam Chair, I don't know that I would have the information to be able to speak on why exactly that is. Most anything would just be a hypothesis.
And, okay.
Mr. Moore might be able to provide some better insight into that.
Well, so we also know that we have a higher identification rate than the national average. That was presented to this task force in May. And so I guess one of the questions, and maybe Mr. Moore or Dr. Harwood would know, do we ever, I don't want to, not audit, but do we ever examine how we're identifying our special education students to determine that, we're accurately and not over-identifying or under-identifying? It could be either way. So do we look at how we're identifying? I heard a little bit earlier, well, it's kind of a local, individualized, but is there some standard or consistency? I see this, but I'm guessing that can be interpreted in many different ways. So how do we ensure that we're being accurate in that?
So, Madam Chair, I defer to Mr. Moore that specific element I've not had a chance to dig into.
I can't see you sometimes, Mr. Moore. I
sir,
apologize, around
I see someone
Revisor
right there.
Long, so yes, Mr. Moore.
I think the situation is that we do monitoring on a regular level of systems, but systems are not identifying because they're making money off of students, and I want that first to be clear. But the second thing is that identification is individualized, and since COVID, we've had a lot more students that are presenting with learning problems and behaviors, and I'm not going to try and diagnose why that's happening or identify why that's happening. So we have seen an increase since COVID in the eligibility for students qualifying. We also have more parents that are savvy to knowing their rights and knowing like what Senator Estes pointed out. They want services and they are coming in, they're asking for us to do the identification and look at eligibility. So we've got more parent consistent. We also have teachers, gen ed teachers that are seeing behaviors or seeing learning issues in the classroom that they don't feel capable of handling. And so they're making more referrals through the general education intervention process. Through all of those issues for the last 4 years that I've seen since COVID, we have seen an increase in eligibility. We've had a lot more emotionally disabled situations show up, and some of those are going to show up with a DD, developmental delay. And that's why that number continues to increase. That's what I'm getting from my research here in the state. And I know I've got a lot of people here, but we can get more information for you on what they're seeing.
Director Ricker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Based on the analysis conducted in 2017 when we were looking at the formula at that time, I think one of we've talked a lot about the weaknesses of our current method of distributing special ed funding based on the licensed special ed teachers and the reimbursement rates and all of those things, which, are things, right? But the flip side is that over time I think there's something wrong with this mic. I hear it going in and out. Through the sequence of the audits that have been done historically, one of the factors identified with not using the student-based model is to avoid what I think you're curious about, is whether or not we are increasing the identification and therefore there's more money in the special ed weighting category going to school districts. The current formula outlines something very different. So schools are not in a position to earn more money when there are more students identified. One of the things, the package that we have in front of us in terms of the eligibility indicators is useful. I also pulled years ago, it at the time was chapter 1 and the ks.gov special ed handbook is devoted to parent rights in special education. And it is both baked into IDEA that parents drive that process, whether it's requesting evaluation or, requesting. I think it's state statute in Kansas that gives parents the right to insist the IEP continues. Right? There is a role for parents parents have to end up agreeing to remove the special services, or is that still a thing? Because it was in 2017.
Yes, it's still a thing. A parent has the right to consent or not to consent to an action recommended by the agency. And if the parent's recommending, let's say, that the child exit and the parent refuses to sign, then the district has maybe the right to ask for dispute resolution, but the student stays in their place during any dispute, and many systems will just go ahead and provide services.
Thank you. I think it's important. I think the guidebook outlines it in depth. It might be useful if the committee's curious if that got pulled and provided.
So before we continue, nowhere in my question about why we're seeing the trend that we're seeing in that chart did I say a district or anybody's doing it for money. In fact, I said maybe we're under-identifying. How do we know we're accurate? So let me make that abundantly clear. I just want to make sure we're accurately identifying students so we can best serve. This assumption that somehow there's the insinuation that it's so districts can have more money. Never did I say that. And never did I insinuate that. I want accurate so that we can best serve our kids. That may be more money. It may be, that's not the point, and that was not the intent of my question.
Madam Chair, I was not meaning to imply that that was the intent of your question. I was simply engaging in the
Just
discussion.
making it clear, because there was the insinuation stated by two people at this table that said, it's not because districts are trying, I never, ever, that was not the intent of my question. I want to make that abundantly clear. I want to make sure we're accurately identifying. So I just want to make that abundantly clear. The reason for my question is to accurately identify students so they get the services and resources they need. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In 2020, my two sons were in the number of kids that dropped in enrollment because I decided to homeschool during the pandemic. And I re-enrolled my child with special needs sooner than my son, who is a general ed student, because his needs were greater than I could provide. And my school district in Olathe is exceptional in that regard. So I think that does, if you have a student and you're trying to homeschool, and they have special needs, it's much harder to meet those needs. So I could see how parents might re-enroll their children to access those services that they can't themselves provide. The other point I wanted to make is, you mentioned that we have a higher ID rate than the national average. That may be because we do dyslexia and we do giftedness. That would add to our overall numbers. So thank you.
Yes, I would agree, but that's been the trend before we even had those, at least dyslexia in there. Representative Estes.
Mr. Moore, we got into the parents' rights conversation here. Is it a requirement under IDA that each state has an ombudsman for parents?
For non-public, we have an ombudsman. The advocate would be your local school district, and then if you fail to get anything secured there, then you call the State Department, and then we provide advocacy on the part of that parent and reach out to that district and work with them on how we can resolve whatever difference there is. So we don't have an assigned ombudsman for parents. We do have a parent information training center, Families Together. They are the unit in our state that provides parent and family support. And oftentimes we will, if things are going awry, we'll refer our parents over to them to get training and to get information and to get advocacy. So I would have to say the PTI and Families Together, and they're highly effective.
And do you have to have already gone through the identification process? Or if you are in that phase where you're saying, I would like testing for something, do you still get access to that?
You would have access because the Parents' Rights has several different groups that are listed for you to receive advocacy, and one of those is Families Together, and one is the Disability Rights Center. There's also a federal advocacy that can be obtained. Parents have the right to request an evaluation, and the district has to do one of two things. They either give them a prior written notice that they're going to provide the evaluation, or they provide a prior written notice that they don't want to do the evaluation, in which case the parent has the right to ask for dispute resolution with the system.
And I think, so, and I'm glad to hear those things, but I think that there is a communication problem because too many parents are unaware. For 2 of my 3 children, I had to fight so hard to get them tested. And I think it's, and I'm going a little bit beyond what we're here for today, but because I'm passionate about it. But my other question that I had for you is when you said something about COVID, and I think we need to try to learn as many lessons from what we did during COVID, and you're seeing an increase in delays after COVID. Is anybody doing any kind of research on that? Are we looking to cause and effect relationship? Are we looking for what do we know for next time so we don't have that happen? And is that uptake attributable to kids not being in the classroom? What do we know?
I think you just mentioned everything that might be included. We haven't done any research as an agency on that, to my knowledge. There may be universities that are reaching out and doing studies. I don't know if Frank knows of anything that might be done in the way of research.
I mean, there has been a lot of research done on, or started with the impacts of COVID. I don't know how much of that research is ongoing because of how it's being funded. So I know there has been some, but I don't know what's going on necessarily now.
Sometimes I wish I saw us being more proactive in asking our universities to help find the answers for us. So thank you, I appreciate that.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments at this point? And just for everyone, I know that we are not perhaps right on the agenda. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the discussion can be intertwined as we go. I think that's probably more productive. So we won't sit here and discuss. We discuss as we go. So we will adjourn at 4, but I think it's just probably more timely and relevant if we just discuss as we go. So just that clarification. So Matthew, you may continue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So moving on to the next slide, this one kind of dives into some of the questions or discussion about Kansas percentages versus the United States. So I do want to clarify that these are not like an average. This is a cumulative of the United States. So of all of the IDEA students in the U.S., 13% of them have autism nationally. Kansas, we're at 8%. As you'll see, and probably kind of tying into that discussion of developmentally delayed, Kansas is much higher than the national at 19%. That, along with specific learning disability, that's a little bit, are the two that are higher. Everything else is either pretty close or slightly below. And this is, again, specifically for the 22-23 school year, as that's the most current for this kind of national data. All right. I guess I'd paused one too soon. That was the end of my student one. So moving right into staffing, there's like 3 slides, so it'll be a little bit quicker. So this first one, kind of similar to how I did with students, this is showing the green slivers are both for licensed and non-licensed special education staff versus the kind of lavender counterparts, which would be non-special education staff. I'll note for the licensed, I added together what was reported for special education teacher, special education directors, speech pathologist, and audiologist. So I will not pretend that this is exhaustive, as there could, I presume, very well be other licensed staff who are just under different kind of headers that I did not add into this. And then for the non-licensed, the green is essentially special education paras, and the purple and the lavender is again everyone else. So similarly, this table shows for 2025 the FTE, but then along with the USD categories that I just listed off in the previous slide, this also includes special education paraprofessionals and special education teachers that are at interlocals. And so you can kind of see like all of those combined, that it's around 17,580.9 FTEs of staff. And then in the final one, I guess not the final one, the second to final one, here's it kind of showing a trend line. Essentially, you can see that around school year 1920, 2021, the interlocals seem to kind of drop off and kind of get lower in their FTEs for both paraprofessionals and teachers, while the districts have, in general, been climbing since then. So just for reference, from 2016, the 2016 school year through 2025, there's been 844.7 FTEs added, but that's with school districts adding just over 2,000 FTEs and interlocals losing about 1,200 FTEs. And then the final one that I have on staffing was just showing I took the head count of the IDEA and gifted students for each of the school years, and then divided that by the number of special education FTEs I had, similar to kind of the slides I've been showing, to get kind of a student to staff ratio, specifically of the special education students to at least what I've identified as probably a limited element of staff. And that kind of breaks out to Kansas generally hovering around about 5 special education students per special education FTE. And that is the end of my staffing slide, so I'd be happy to stand for questions on that.
Any question on the staffing? Seeing none?
All right. Moving on. So this is the fiscal information. It's going to be several charts that are all going to look kind of similar because they're laid out pretty much the same, but it's going to be for USDs, for co-ops, and then for interlocals. And so what you'll see on your handouts or on the screen is on the left-hand side is available resources for school districts, specifically in their special education fund. So what was their unencumbered cash balances, local revenues, state revenue, federal revenue, and then I broke out general fund transfer and supplemental general fund transfer because, as I believe it was mentioned earlier, when a school district receives its special education state aid, it gets initially deposited in the general fund and then they transfer it over. And so that is why you see little to no state revenue on that chart, is because most of it is that special education state aid, which is showing up in that green line of the general fund transfer revenue. And then on the right side is showing kind of those expenses for the same year, broken out by kind of major functions. So you'll see the instruction and student support services are the main drivers, followed then with some transportation kind of being the next chunk after that. Similarly, then, moving on to cooperatives, this does look a little different because I wanted to break out, as we discussed, where cooperatives and interlocals get a lot of their revenue as essentially payments or transfers from school districts. You'll see that that yellow is calling out the payments they received from districts and separating that from what their other local revenues are. And then again, on the right side is all the same services, all the same colors. So once again, you'll see that instruction and student support services drive that. And then when you get to interlocals, I unfortunately ran out of time adding the data for 21 and 22, so I can update that and get it out to the committee at a future date. But unfortunately, I just have the last 2 years of data for those. Again, you'll see I broke out the payments from districts to kind of show relative to other things on their revenues. Same thing on their expenditures. And then the final one is me combining all of these. So seeing for those 3 different entities, what does it show? And there I lumped the transfer together because since districts outside of the special education state aid that they'll transfer have some kind of ability of choosing which funds they're transferring it from, I thought lumping it together would show a better picture than any differences of just 1 year they decided more general fund and 1 year more LOB. And then finally, this last one is just kind of a trend line. The burgundy, the top kind of purple line is showing what special education expenses have been. The pink line is showing the trend for special education state aid. And then the yellow one is showing transfers that exclude special education state aid. So I backed that out of the transfer data so you can see what are districts transferring that is not just that special education state aid. And again, all of this is representative of just what the school districts are getting, not what special education state aid is going directly to interlocals or in any other kind of elements. This was just school districts. So with that, I'd be happy to stand for questions for maybe the final time. I guess I have one more presentation, so not quite.
Vice Chair Estes, then Director Rooker.
Thank you, Matthew. I just have one little thing that I think would be helpful for transparency for other people when they look at slide number 17. And if you look at that, and you weren't one of us who deals with this all the time, you might go, oh, it looks like the state isn't putting state revenue in, because I think what you mean there is other state non-SGF revenue, and we don't attribute the general fund as coming through the state. So if we could make that change in the future, so it is a little more clear, that I think that would be helpful.
Yep. Madam Chair, Representative, I'd be happy to do that. I could probably even try and break out general fund to show the difference of state special education, state aid, and then the general fund on top of that. But yes, I can do that to try and help capture that better.
Thank you very much.
Director Rooker.
That may have captured, because I was going down the same path. I mean, I think the general fund label, like when we're talking about whether it's state or USD, there are general funds in both places. So I think helping us, because this seems misleading when I think about anything in a school district, general operating budget, it is like, maybe not anything and everything, but most of it is attributable to state appropriations. So I think some clarity so that it doesn't give this impression that there is no state revenue when that green bar is mostly state revenue, right?
By and large, yes. I've not looked at the numbers, but yes, I would assume the lion's share of it.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm assuming these are like end of fiscal year numbers. I get frustrated when people oversimplify this and try to say, everybody's sitting on a pile of cash. It would be really interesting to me to maybe have an idea of where people are, maybe at the end of September, or not people, districts, because I think that would be a more accurate reflection of reserves, particularly in districts that are building schools. You know, they have obligations, so that money may be there, but it doesn't mean that they're flush with cash. So maybe an asterisk would have made me feel a little bit better or something, but I think that it's not a very complete picture because of the way we disperse, the timing.
Any other questions or comments or requests from staff? Seeing none, thank you very much. Yes, Vice Chair Estes, hold on.
This one actually is for Dr. Harwood. I'm sorry. I was really shocked to see the enrollment number. You know, we had a severe dip during COVID. We were told numbers were going back up. I had not been aware that numbers went down as much as they did. What do we know about that?
Dr. Harwood.
That was slide 15.
So let me get back to the chart. One thing I would point out is that the scale on the student head count is very different. So the drop looks really dramatic. All of them are big changes when you look at the numbers. The colleges have been talking about it for a long time. There is a decline in, the birth rate is going down. And so that's part of it. The other part, we've done some information on using census data, as Representative McDonald talked about in 2020, actually 2020-21, there was a shift in where people were going to school. Public schools lost some went to homeschool, others went to private school. Private schools lost them to homeschool, and it was always because everybody was either doing too much or not enough. Since that time, we've seen that balance back out, but there are more students in home. Based on census estimates, there are more students in homeschool now than there were at that time, we think. We don't have good information about homeschool because we don't collect anything about homeschool students.
Okay, but that's not related to the raw number of students not in a public school. It's like, do we know why people aren't picking public?
Well, one, I think there are fewer students to actually make the choice. So part of it is a decline in school-age population. Other than that, I would have to look into it more to have another answer for that.
Thank you. I hope that we do.
Anything else? Director Ricker.
It would be useful if research could equip us with that census data, because I think the trend line that we hear about is aging population, fewer kids under, whether, I was track birth to 5, but this is up to 18 or 21, whatever we're looking at. So if we could have that context to layer on, I think it might put the enrollment trend in better perspective for all of us.
Vice Chair Estes.
I think that would be interesting because I'm really looking from, 21 to 25, that's 4 years. And that, and if you look at the time period before, the COVID drop made sense, but I don't think we had such a deep decline for the last 4 years that it explains to me where. So yeah, let's add the context and see what the problem really looks like. McDonald.
Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I remember when I unenrolled my kids from public school and started a private or a homeschool at my house, there's a form you have to fill out, and it's in statute. But you don't have to do anything ever again. I'm wondering if it might make sense and give us more data if they had to resubmit that, if parents who are homeschooling had to resubmit that form each year. It might give us clarity on how many kids we actually do have homeschooling. Thank you.
Vice Chair Estes.
But my question really is about the kids in public school. I'm not concerned about the kids in private school. We've got this peak on slide 4. We lost a lot of kids during COVID. We started to recover in 23, and now here we are in 25, and it dropped back down. So my question isn't about who's in homeschool. It's about why aren't people picking public school? And yes, let's put the context in so we know how many, the census data, I think that makes sense. But that's a pretty sharp up and a pretty sharp down, and I think we need to understand why that's happening. Our market is sending us a message that we need to pay attention to.
Dr. Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can only speak for Johnson County Schools because we all do some type of analysis, and birth rates in the state of Kansas, particularly in the northeast part of the state, have dropped 5 consecutive years. So when we look at birth rate data, we're down about 7% less kids being born 5 years ago than today. So I'm guessing that plays out statewide, just speculating, of course, but I'm certain the census data or birth rate data might be more usable for us to look at that data.
That's interesting because Johnson County has the fastest growth rate in the state. So it's interesting, then it begs the question, if it's growing, what's the demographics of the growth? So I think the census data will shed some light on that. So it's very helpful. Representative McDonald.
Just to clarify, I really feel like having more data is better. And we already require those parents who are homeschooling to do that initial paperwork. So I wasn't trying to say that I was answering your question. I think it's just one bit of the data in the piece of pie that would help us to explain a little bit. Thank you.
Dr. Harwood.
So kind of back to my first comment about the scale on this, is that when you look from 2023 to 2025, that's, if I'm reading this right, a decrease of about 8,000 or about 4,000 students out of 480,000 students, which is 0.8%. I mean, so I think we need to also look at, I did that really fast on my phone, so I might have gotten a 0 off somewhere. But I think the scale here is throwing off how dramatic the change is. And so that would be the other thing, is maybe we get this on a flatter scale and put it together with census data. And if there is a downward trend, so all those things go together. So I think the graph itself may be exacerbating what is a smaller problem. Now, it's declining, and we do need to look at, is it declining at the same rate as the birth rate? And if it is, and we also need to look at in and out migration, because you're talking about Johnson County, the birth rate has gone down, but you have people moving in. But the birth rate has also gone down across the rest of the state, so they're moving in with fewer kids. So, that's all part of how that's working out. So I think we just need to make sure we're looking at the right picture when we're asking the question.
Yes, Board Member Porter.
This may not even be relevant, but I represent about 75 school districts, and all of them that are not declining in enrollment would be in the single digits. So about 70 of the 75 school districts I represent are actually declining in enrollment, and that's going to have some, because the communities are declining in enrollment.
Anything else? Seeing none, I think Matthew, I appreciate your presentation and your information. We will move on to Jennifer Light from KLRD with a review on special education funding in state aid.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jennifer Light, and I'm with KLRD. Good news. Most of what I was going to talk about, we have already talked about today. So
that was the plan, Jennifer.
It was the whole plan to begin with. So we will be moving much quicker to the next section, hopefully. But I do have a memo which talks about how special education funding interacts with foundation aid. We did discuss this earlier, so I'm happy to not read through the actual memo itself, but just kind of stand here for if we want to discuss foundation aid and special education funding overall, or if there are any other questions. Or I'm happy to go ahead and start through the memo and let you all have a few minutes to think about what questions you may actually have on funding.
Go ahead and get us started, and then as questions arise, we'll just jump in.
Sure thing. So special education funding, the memo I am referring to is the one that is titled Special Education Funding and Foundation Aid, if you are trying to follow along with which one of the handouts we're talking about. So it's the only weighting that is considered an independently appropriated section of state aid and is also technically included within the foundation aid calculations. As we've talked about multiple times today and over the course of this task force, the special education funding comes from three sources: local, state, and federal funding. The federal funding has been pretty static and is provided both directly to school districts and through the Kansas State Department of Education. The memo says it's about 10%. It's been up a little bit in the last couple of years, so partially due to ESSER funds, but so we have gotten up to about 14%, but overall, if you look over the trend line, we're closer to 10. The rest of the funding for special education comes from state and local sources. For the last several years, special education state aid has made up approximately 50% of the overall funding that goes into the special education funding, and local contributions have been 40%. Now, I want to be clear when I'm saying these are out of total funding, where that's not about excess costs. That's just, here is the dollar, and out of that dollar, 50 cents of that dollar is coming from special education state aid. So when I'm saying 50%, I'm not talking about excess costs at that point. I'm just talking about percentages of the full dollar. Although these funding portions may seem straightforward, the percentages listed do not account for base or other weightings provided by the state, as those are handled, as we've discussed, by removing them out of the special education state aid for excess costs. On page 2, you can see that special education state aid table has been provided from fiscal year 2019 all the way up to fiscal year 2027. Fiscal years 2025, 26, and 27 are the dollar amounts that were appropriated by the 2025 legislature. As we have discussed special education state aid multiple times, I'm not going, the memo does not touch on that specifically. You have a full memo that regarding school finance formulas about that. If you have questions, happy to talk about it, but we're going to move past the special education state aid and go back and focus on foundation aid. So school districts are allowed by statute to adopt a local option budget, and the local option budget is calculated as the percentage of a district's modified total foundation aid. Total foundation aid, as most of you are aware, is calculated by taking base times weighted FTE enrollment. So in order to come up with a total, or in order to come up with total foundation aid, you have to have the weighted FTE for special education included. So the top of page 3 talks about the special education weighting, which is how we work our way backwards into what the weighting is based on the amount of money that the districts are receiving through special education state aid. So you take the dollar amount and you divide it by base, and that gets you to the special education weighting. There is an example that I provided there. Then, as was discussed, we remove it back out when we talk about state aid, or state foundation aid. So when we talk about state foundation aid, it is separate from special education state aid, and the money for special education state aid is not included in the base for state foundation aid. I feel like we have covered this a lot today, but if that is still confusing to somebody, I just want to make sure that I pause here to make sure that there aren't questions about that. Okay. So therefore, we talk about the local option budget modified total foundation aid. So if you look at the top of page 4, we're going to talk about 2 modifications that happen to total foundation aid in order to produce the local option budget. I do want to note that at the top of page 4, I did say this allows school districts to raise local funds to help support special education, as in addition to receiving state and federal dollars. That was written in response to the 2024 change in the law. That is, as Dr. Harwood has said today, it was not intended to begin with when changing the local option budget amounts due to it. It was not intended to be covering special education only. But since the 2024, that was I just want to caveat that is not the original intent of how the modified local option budget occurred. So there is an artificial base which is applied to the foundation aid for local option budget only. This originally was, I'm not going to get this right, 4,492. So that was what it was when it was originally put in. However, since 2020, the artificial base has increased annually based upon the average percentage increase of the CPI for the Midwest region during the 3 immediate preceding years. This is the same CPIU adjustment that is done for base. It just started earlier than the base adjustments for CPIU did. So for fiscal year 2025, the artificial base was $5,452, and since base was $5,378 in fiscal year 25, when calculating the modified total foundation aid, the number was multiplied by 452 instead of 5,378. So that covers all weightings across the board. The other option that affects special education specifically is that school districts have the option to use the special education state aid amount that district received in fiscal year 2009 rather than the amount that they use in the current year, if that amount is higher than the one in the current year, because I know I wouldn't turn down extra money if it was currently higher than it was in 2009. So, but they have the option to choose which one of the 2 they are going to use. So if a school district receives $1.9 million in special education state aid this year, and in 2009 they received $2 million, the school district would use the $2 million amount when calculating their LOB. Not for special education state aid, just for calculating the LOB portions. And I've laid out a calculation for modified total foundation aid for that for you underneath that. So why is this important? Well, you are covering all of the state foundation aid and all of the other aid for going out from the state to school districts. And so we wanted to make sure that we drew attention to the fact that the local option budget does have this requirement for the going back to the fiscal year 2009 versus using the current year, and the calculations for how the local option budget is calculated. And why is the calculation important? Because of the transfers that we've talked about multiple times today as well. The state aid is required to be transferred into the special education fund. Additionally, the state aid for special education is required to be transferred into the special education fund. And then again, as of fiscal year 25, school districts are also required to transfer funding from its LOB fund or the supplemental fund to which is the equivalent of the amount of the district's total foundation aid, which is attributable to the special education weighting. I do want to note that a district is not required to transfer more funding into its special education fund than those two amounts. However, should a district need more funding for the provision of special education, it can choose to add more funding from either the general fund, the local option budget fund, or any other of the funds that they are legally allowed to transfer funds from. So when we talk about the school district A transferred an additional $300,000 into their special education fund, that could come from a variety of different funds. It does not have to come from a specific fund. With that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to stand for questions on how special education funding works with foundation aid or any other topics about funding that we would like to talk about.
Thank you, Jennifer. Any questions? Yes, Representative McDonald, then Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We might have gotten this, but I've probably slept since then. It would be helpful to me to know which funds are limited on how the money's spent, like having a list of those, because one thing I hear from my districts is this money comes with strings. You can only spend it this way or that way. And so in the effort of simplifying things, it would help me very much to have that on one nice chart. Thank you.
Okay, I think they're capturing that. Senator Petty.
So, Jennifer, when you were talking about the 2009 option, it seems like that is ongoing. It seems like a school district that has declining enrollment, that would be, I mean, I suspect we could look at that, but that would be an option that they would be choosing because they would have a higher number in 2009 than they might in 2025 if their enrollment's been dropping, just as Mr. Porter said about 75 school districts that he represents. All but a handful of them are declining. So with that, do we have any idea?
Madam Chair, what I can say is that this is special education funding only, so it's based off of the special education students, not off of total enrollment in your schools. So it is possible, yes, that a school district that has a declining enrollment in general is getting more money for special education than their total enrollment may have factored into. However, there are schools where total enrollment has dropped, but special education FTE have increased. And so there are different ways that it could go. There are schools where there are school districts where the money in 2025 is higher than the money from 2009. And so it really just depends on the school district and the special education dollar amount.
And then my second one, when you said about, I just want to remind you, if a school district has excess costs and they make a choice because they're paying for these costs, like we'll take Olathe with $34 million, they put that into their special ed fund. Once it goes into the special ed fund, it can only be used for special ed services, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Harwood.
That would also be helpful on the list of funds, or the ones that you can transfer out of and the ones you can't transfer out of. So for instance, for special ed, there is no mechanism to transfer funds back out of that. Now you can maybe not have to transfer as much the next year, but there are several funds where there are mandatory transfers in and there is not the ability to transfer out.
Matthew, did you get that request? Okay, yes, Dr. Rooker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Harwood, the audit process at the end, like that June audit of what actually occurred, that interacts with this set of provisions that we just heard about, in that it may be the 2009 rate, but in the end, if the expenses weren't that full amount, the district would not be pocketing above and beyond what they actually had to expend that year. Is that correct?
So in terms of special education, you are correct. However, we would be auditing the special education expenses. What Jennifer was talking about is if your special education allocation was greater in 2008, 2009 than it is now, you use that number to calculate your LOB. That's not what you get for special education. So you would have access to that in your LOB regardless of what you spent in special education. Because as a matter of fact, in order to get it, you had to get less in special education. So, but I mean, so that everybody, because you asked the auditing question, so because the last special education payment is in June, special education expenses are audited a year behind. And then, just so everybody knows, is that if you weren't eligible for those expenses, you get a negative correction, which means we reduce what you're going to get this year. We don't do positive corrections, which means, so if you underclaim, you don't get the money back. If you overclaim, we take that out of what we're going to give you this year.
Okay, any other questions for Jennifer? Seeing none? Thank you, Jennifer, appreciate it.
Thank you. I'll be back tomorrow, everyone.
We will look forward to that. Okay, next we have an overview of special education outcomes, again with Matthew Willis from KLRD. He assures me that he's going to get us right back on track here, so.
Good afternoon again, Madam Chair, members of the committee. In case you've forgotten, my name is Matthew Willis, Principal Research Analyst with Legislative Research. So I have kind of a one-page handout. It has these blue headers and is titled Special Education State Assessment and NAEP Scores. I believe, if I understand right, that Mr. Moore will also be kind of discussing outcomes. I was asked to kind of provide a little bit about outcomes for special education students, and a lot of it is that there's not much as far as reportable data, which I mean makes sense as far as with each of them having an individualized education plan, their goals are all individual. And so this sheet is going to kind of show you how have they been on state assessments, as well as kind of what some of the NAEP testing is. Special education students do all get tested for state assessments unless they opt out. My understanding is, like with anything, is it would be an assessment with whatever accommodations are required via their IEP plans, but it still can kind of give you some ability to see how they are testing on it. And then I also did jot down on graduation rates. So just for example, in the 23-24 school year, 84.1% of students listed as students with disabilities on KSD's Data Central graduated from high school. That is up from in 2021, where it was 81.1%. So that's a lot of what I have, just in, there's some assessment scores, but there was not a lot that I could find as far as larger kind of ways of measuring success. But I'll kind of defer to Mr. Moore for what I assume will be his much more knowledgeable understanding for that kind of discussion with the task force.
Thank you for this, Matthew. Yes, Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just would like to caution everybody to not harken back to the days of No Child Left Behind when we over-rely on test scores. I would argue that we do have a lot of data about the progress that special ed students make, because every IEP has measurable goals, and quarterly, if not more often, we find out how they're doing. So it might be that we could tap into some of that IEP data and extrapolate some larger measurements by compiling them on whether or not they met their individual goal, or when their milestones, how long it took them to meet those goals, that sort of thing.
So, Madam Chair, Representative, yes, and I apologize for not clarifying that. Yes, there are other, but as far as what is currently reported to KSDE or what we have access to, my understanding is there isn't any kind of larger reporting mechanic of those elements of how many students have met their goals by the time they end the IEP and leave the system, or any of those. Those would be at a local level, but are not in any way aggregated where we could kind of look at a more qualitative understanding.
So that's a little bit news to me, and I guess my question might go to Frank and company. Would it be a reasonable ask to try to get districts to help us gather that data? Do you have ideas on how we should do that? Because we just talk so much about NAEP, and it's not that NAEP's not important, but it was probably the last thing I had on my kid's mind, and, you know, state assessments were not something I value as much as an IEP and meeting those specific goals that are for him.
I think you're the end company.
Yeah,
Mr.
I
Moore.
think you're asking for an answer. I think the issue with IEP goals is that they're written in a manner that we want to make sure that they can be achievable within 1 year. So they are individualized, so we don't have a standard that we use and we start here as a baseline and we want to get the student to here. Each one is individualized based upon the needs of that child for either content instruction, behavior, supports and services, related services, and then we do progress monitoring. I'm giving you my report right now. We do progress monitoring 4 times a year, typically, when general education students receive any type of progress monitoring. Students with disabilities are to receive that, including progress on IEP goals and objectives. If the student is not able to meet those goals or they have met those goals, then the IEP team is required to meet again and decide that they're going to modify those goals. For a student with other health impairment, depending upon when they're having an episode or an issue with their health, it may be that we want to change that goal and we want to reduce the stress on the child to commit to whatever we've written into that IEP. For other students that are really achieving well, then we want to make sure that we're not holding them to a standard that's below what they can achieve. The other issue is they're general education students as well. So they are being measured in the content curriculum at grade level because all of our IEP goals and objectives are to be at grade level. So they have general education obligation to receive the same sort of grade or outcome measure as general education students do. And so they have the 2 prongs, both the gen ed assessment, or I shall say progress monitoring, and the special education IEP progress monitoring. But it's so hard to set for all kids. They're all going to be here when you individualize it. You know that from having had your students on IEPs. So I'll leave it at that, but we really don't have a way to look at that other than to look at the IEPs, and under the Andrew F. case, they have to make progress in lieu of their circumstances. They can't be plateaued. They can't just be at the same goals and objectives every year. You have to modify those in a manner that shows that the child can make progress.
Thank you for that. I appreciate all of that. And I guess what gave me pause is, you know, the title says the overview of special education outcomes, and what we have here is just one snapshot, which is NAEP. And I think that each child has a much larger set of data that does show outcomes in a more accurate manner than this chart. So if we have ideas on other data points, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
I appreciate that, but to Matthew's comment earlier, this is what we can aggregate and have. Are there perhaps more accurate, better? Absolutely, but at this point in time, we don't have any way of capturing that, and so maybe that's something we can look at going forward. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Next up, we have a presentation on special education by Bert Moore, the Director of Special Education and Title Services from KSDE.
Sorry, thank you. I was given my questions last week to cover, so I just want to clarify what the questions I was given, and I'm glad to answer anything that you have as a task force today. My first area was paraeducators. You should have received something from Gabby that came around the room. Did those get distributed? Did everybody get one? Good. So how are paraeducators defined for special education in Elementary and Secondary Education Act? Because we do have paras that work in a variety of environments within the school, but if they are a special education para, they have to be assigned to a professional. So they can provide support, instructional support and related services support, and under that supervision, then they are granted the ability to provide direct support to students. So SPED paras have as a minimum requirement, they must be a high school graduate or they have to have a GED. They have to complete an orientation session. They also have to have the services that they provide, the policies and procedures of the local education agency concerning special ed support. So in other words, each agency decides what additional in-service a person will need before they can be a para and assigned to work with students in the classroom. Special ed paras have required PD that includes a minimum of 20 hours in their first 3 years. This is a minimum, it's not a maximum. I had paras that could gain up to 60 hours if they took any college classes during their term in my cooperative. And if they have less than 3 years, or if they have more than 3 years, in that fourth year, they only need 10 hours of professional development. However, I think you'll find that many of our agencies provide more hours than that. Allowable activities, I want to stress these, include instructional support under the supervision of a professional. They can participate in IEP meetings. They can attend parent-teacher conferences. They can collect data on students, and they can do record keeping. They can assist the special ed professional with required paperwork. They can provide support to students with disabilities in gen ed classrooms and supporting students with disabilities in general education environments as listed in the students' IEPs. Now, the ESEA or title paras that work in a school-wide, we have two types of ESEA programs. We have targeted assistance and we have what we call school-wide. Targeted assistance programs are developed so that certain students are targeted for direct support within that building, and this is done at a building level. So targeted assistance, they must meet the minimum para requirements. They have to have a high school diploma, a GED. Now, if they work in a school-wide, they must be highly qualified. That means they have to pass an assessment, they have to have 48 college hours or more, or they can hold an associate's degree. And those are the minimum requirements to work in a school-wide title program for all paras that work in that building. So any para that's hired to work in a school-wide building has to meet these qualifications. Now, many of us in special education have decided that we want all of our paras, I did that in my cooperative, be highly qualified. And so they had to pass an assessment, have 48 college hours, or have an associate's degree, because I wanted to be able to show the public that my paras were highly qualified to work with students. So then how do schools and KSDE ensure that special ed paras spend their time with special ed students in mainstream classrooms? Interesting, because special ed paras provide supports and services under that licensed professional, and they can work in general education classrooms and also support a special ed classroom, work in community settings, home settings, or any setting as outlined in the individual student's IEPs under the direct supervision of the professional. And they can complete time and effort logs, and that's a requirement that they complete time and effort logs so that they can prove that they're providing special education services. Only the time listed that serves IEP students is counted as special ed eligible time to be reimbursed through special ed categorical state aid. So KSDE fiscal auditors conduct annual audits of special ed programs in Kansas, and they work with the KSDE Special Ed and Title Services team, and they remove any paid hours of reimbursement that the agency was not owed. So in other words, when we look at accountability, if I list that as a 1.0 para, but I can't show that that para worked 1,116 hours, then any hours under 1,116 will be reduced from the reimbursement. So how is a para time prorated so that special ed funding is targeted to the intended purpose? Well, special ed paras have the time audited annually, and the auditors do check the letters of employment to ensure that pairs are hired to provide special education supports and services under a licensed professional. Each pair must complete the time and effort logs as audited by KSDE, and the categorical aid system called PCA, or Personnel Categorical Aid, lists all professionals claimed for reimbursement, and included under each professional are those paraprofessionals that are assigned to that licensed professional. So outcomes for special education, I think I started to answer this for Representative McDonald, and I think it will be very similar here, but I'll stop and see if you have any questions to this point before I move on.
Yes, I think maybe we'll just ask if there are any questions on the para portion before we go to outcomes. Are there? Yes, Representative Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I might have the terminology wrong. G minutes are when SPED students are pulled to a special education classroom,
Yes.
and C minutes are considered is in class, they're not pulled, in-class support.
Yeah, inclusionary support would be C, and any type of pull-out service away from that classroom would be considered direct services. So a student can receive direct services in a gen ed classroom when a person goes into that classroom, but that would move it to a C service.
Okay. So can paras, under a supervision of a licensed special education teacher, give G minutes?
They can give direct instruction if they can't give the initial direct instruction, but once they've been trained by their professional, they can support that instruction either in a resource room environment or in a general education environment.
Initial instruction to me means today in math, we are learning that 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, I'm just being very basic here. So to me, that I am introducing to the addition sign in 2. So I can not make a para do that initial instruction. Is that correct?
What I have to do is I have to plan the lesson plan. We have in the reimbursement guide, which you'll get a link to, it clarifies all of this. But it comes out that that para has to have the training from the professional in how to support that student in a general ed environment where they could support 2 + 2 = 4, as long as they're under the direct supervision of that professional who has provided to the student the initial training. So the teacher provides the training to the student, the para is observing, then the para is allowed to provide practice. Did that help?
That was key right there. Thank you. So the teacher that this para is under, does that teacher have to be in the same building at the time that the para is giving this additional instruction?
No. We have itinerant staff. They have a minimum number of hours they must work with each para each week. And in Western Kansas in particular, you may have one teacher that travels to 3 or 4 different buildings a day. But that teacher has to ensure that they have provided the direct instruction to those students that they want practiced with the para. And then the para can provide that instruction to the students once that has been done. But we can't hire paras to supplant hiring teachers. That's the whole point here.
So glad you said that. Thank you. So is there a general, what does training mean? I understand we all have professional development in our careers. That I'm not getting at that. But how does a district ensure that this special education teacher has provided to this para the training that is necessary so they are providing that high quality education?
They have to monitor it at the local level through administrators ensuring that they're working with those teachers, training the teachers in knowing what the model requires, and then ensuring that that's being delivered through observation, because everybody has to be evaluated annually. The professional evaluates the classified staff, which would be the para, but the administrators are evaluating those professionals, and this is something they should check when they're doing their either walkabouts or actually working directly with their teachers.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So as someone who's been a building administrator, please tell me it's changed. The training I got in my school leadership was woefully inadequate when it came to special education law and the responsibilities of someone without a special education background in doing exactly what you said. So is there this type of it certainly was woefully inadequate with the administrators that I was with several years ago. So tell me that we're more cognizant of making sure that building leaders and district staff have this type of specialized training to make sure their staff are abiding by this.
I'm glad you brought that up because a year or two ago, the United School Administrators, through support from the Kansas Association of Special Education Administrators, created some cohorts to train our principals in how to work with students with disabilities. So we're on the path of trying to build that capacity. We also plan to up the ante in that this year by providing more support to our special educators who have asked for more information to be shared with general ed administrators on their role and responsibilities. Because that general ed administrator, when they sit in that IEP meeting, they are the primary decision maker of whether that IEP gets implemented or not, whether it be them or their designee. And unfortunately, they are granting designeeship to people that don't have any knowledge in special education. But yet they're there to make that final decision on whether or not the district has the resources and capacity and the financial needs of that student. So we're working on that. I can't say that we've met it completely, but it certainly is a priority of both KSDE and the directors in the state because they brought that to us.
I am so glad to hear that because I do think that that's much needed and that will help address, you know, some of the appropriate role of the staff to better serve our students. So I'm so glad to hear that that effort's being made. Yes, Dr. Neinswander.
On that, I just want to share at a local level, and you'll remember this at the building level, it's so hard. I'm in an interlocal with 8 school districts, and it's hard to get all of those building administrators at the same time out of the building. But 2 years ago, we made a commitment that bi-monthly, all the high school principals come together at the interlocal, work with our director. So it's a lot more emphasis, exactly what I said, United School Administrators, the interlocals, because I can hear it, but I'm not in the building. So it has made a big impact just to carve out and force the time for our building administrators to have a deeper understanding of special education.
Yeah, I'm just thrilled to hear that this is a point of emphasis. Vice Chair Estes.
Thank you. I love that you're breaking it down by level because it does look different, but vast difference between elementary and high school. And I'm glad that this is happening. And based on some of what we've discovered through Blueprint, a lot of teachers are feeling like, hey, we've moved to KESA 2.0, but we don't feel like all of our administrators know how to apply that. And so my question to both of you is, I think in a way you're kind of addressing this, but have we had a conversation with Board of Regents about what we would like to see added to their administrator courses? So that as we continue, like at some point we work ourselves out of this problem by catching it in the university level.
We have worked with universities to tell them that we need our teachers to have more training and more opportunities for practice because so many of them will go through a student teaching opportunity and they're lost because they haven't had a lot of opportunity for internship or practice. It's very hard to build that into a program for your teacher learners and to have it approved through the process that universities have to go through for their programs. But I think we're seeing a better emphasis on it. I'm just not sure of the content and how that content is supporting the need. And I can ask my directors to give me information on how they see universities meeting the need of their administrators. And that's something that Shane Carter, I know, works on the content standards for universities for each of the programs. And so there is an element in there for special education supports and training. And we might want to look at that to see if it's got a depth and breadth that's meeting the needs of our administrators.
I think that's a conversation that would be helpful for everybody to have. Thank you.
Anything else on the para section? Okay, on to outcomes.
Thank you. The outcomes, how are outcomes for special education students measured? Well, it's based on that annual IEP. The individual education program is basically the guiding document that leads the work for that child, and it should include all specially designed instruction that that child requires. You also want to make sure that your general education teachers are present and your administrator so that they can get on board with providing those accommodations or those needed general education environment accommodations, interventions, modifications, adaptations. Because we find that oftentimes general ed teachers do not feel like they're competent to work with our students with disabilities that have more significant concerns. We've had a few issues with students that are experiencing an emotional disability that get out of containment, if you will, and it becomes very difficult on gen ed teachers to not be stressed in those environments. And that's where we provide paras and we provide more support in classrooms. That's why it's individualized. The goals must be measurable, so every goal has to have all of the SMART goals. They have to be measurable. You have to be able to meet those goals. They're targeted specifically for that child, and they're monitored no less frequently than the progress of general education students is monitored. And we do monitor systems for that. That's one of our file review questions is the progress monitoring. And we do ask systems to send us evidence from time to time that they are actually doing it. And if they aren't, then we assign corrective action from my agency. They love it here in the audience. They love file review, by the way. So any student with a disability that the agency has evidence of regression over breaks in school is entitled to extended school year services. That's decided by the IEP team, and those services are designed to maintain the present level of performance. What we have found is we had regression formula that into 45 days into the current year, if a student had regressed from where they were in May the year before, then we could define that they meet extended school year, but we broaden that. It's up to the IEP team to see if the regression is significant enough to cause that child to lose the information they had during that opportunity of the break. Now, in some students, they might even need extended school year over Christmas break, over spring break. It's just up to the IEP team to determine it. It's provided by a professional. So you have to have a licensed professional, and then the paraprofessionals can provide support for extended school year. But again, they have to be supervised, and they have to be directly under that licensed professional person. And I have found myself that auditing will pull back money if my licensed professional has not worked the same number of hours as my paras. And so I have lost a few FTE that way. 0.01, 0.02, because the licensed professional worked 20 hours, the para worked 25. But I still have to provide the service. So it's not about the reimbursement. It's about providing the support and services to the child, whether I got paid for it or not. And then students with disabilities are considered general education students first, and they must receive instruction and make progress in the curriculum. And it's grade level curriculum, because that's how they're assessed. And students with disabilities receive the same measurement of outcomes as all other gen ed students with few exception. So some students with the most significant cognitive disabilities receive instruction using the essential elements, which are aligned with the grade level standards. They're just at a much, what's the word I want to use? A simpler level. I'll just use that word. Because they're not trying to lower anything, they're just trying to meet the level of need of the child, and then we have to show progress in those annually as well. And does it measure effectiveness? Well, that comes from that annual process when we look at the progress made on the grade level standards as well as progress made in the IEP goals and objectives and the benchmarks. That's the important thing. We want to make sure that that student is continuing to progress in the general education curriculum and meeting their goals and objectives. And then how do schools gauge that growth? Well, the exceptionality is not used to gauge reasonable growth. The IEP is designed on an individual basis to meet the needs of identified students with exceptionalities. So that IEP drives the whole process for special education. What should Kansas be doing differently? I had a conversation with Dr. Harwood and Gabby Hull, and we came up with these things that we felt we wanted to stress. We have to establish a cohesive funding formula that considers all service models for special education services. For example, due to the change in how additional special ed funding has been distributed to school districts since fiscal year 2024, infant toddler services did not receive any added funding because it's run through the categorical aid system, because we do allow them to claim staff for birth to 2. That was done before I even got to the state back in 1991. We were allowing infant toddler to claim categorical aid. But because that extra money the last 2 years was not put into categorical aid, they didn't receive the benefit of any of that funding. So it's just an unintended consequence, but I wanted to point that out. And we need to provide a more timely and predictable funding model based on staffing and student needs. And then lastly, attract, retain, and support more professional education staff. This need is especially critical in special education in rural areas. And I did have one thing for Representative Steele. When you asked about the carryover funds, when I built my budget on the positions I planned to fill for the year. The spring vacancy report showed that we had 557 open professional positions. Those were all budgeted positions. That money is not going to be spent this year. It stays in the special ed fund, and it appears like we're carrying it over. We had 447 para vacancies. So there's another example of funding that I have to put in my budget, but then I'm not able to spend, and it ends up flowing to the next year. Now I can base my budgets on where I think I'm going to be the next year, but I just think that's a consideration that people sometimes forget about. Now, do I have any questions?
Questions? Yes, Representative Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Some of these things may be addressed tomorrow, but I'm going to be on WebEx tomorrow, and so I just want to make sure that I do get them when it comes to special education in the least restrictive environment. Is there any specific data that is required by school districts to use? I understand we're talking about individual, and each student is different within their exceptionality, but overall, is there any specific data that is used to determine a least restrictive environment?
We always start in the general education environment. So general ed with supports and services is the first consideration. Then we move to as little pull out as possible or push in of services as possible. And only when we get to the point where the student's needs require specially designed instruction in an alternate gen ed environment do we look at pull out. So the data we would have is looking at our SPED Pro data on how many students are less than 80% of the time receiving, or 60% of the time receiving special ed, under 60%, how many are between 60 and 80%, how many are between 81 and 100% in inclusionary environments. Those are data that we have, and we can get that for the committee. That would be Mason Vosberg. He collects our SPED Pro data. So we do look at that data, and we submit it to the federal government annually.
That would be great. You and I have spoken on the phone before regarding some special education concerns with regards to ensuring that all students that live in a district, regardless if they go to a private school or public school, do receive services. It's my understanding that if a student lives in a school district and they attend a private school, that the local school district is responsible for providing the special education services at the school, so long as it's agreed upon by the IEP team?
It comes down to the local school. I had students that went to Wichita, so I had students in private school in Wichita. Wichita then saw the need for child find at that school, and Wichita provided that support. We did not contract or provide that support, and that was agreeable and it was allowed. Now, if the parent wanted to have IEP services at my district, we could have coordinated to have those at my district. I wasn't fair to the child to have to transport for 60 miles to get them to and from school. So it comes down to an issue of both the private and the public, accredited private, are responsible for, that district's responsible for child fine. So we're all in the business of child fine. And then when it comes to service delivery, that's something that's going to have to be worked out between the private school and the public school. We have what we call a proportionate amount of money that we figure each year, and then we work with private school providers, and we tell them what we can provide within the dollars that we have. So if you have 2 private schools and you end up looking at your proportionate share, it's not a lot of money. It might be $20,000 between the 2. You meet with the administrators at those buildings and say, here's what we can provide for that, but we will provide services at the school, and we can transport back and forth to the school for direct services. So it's not a simple answer to just say, this is how it works every time. It depends on the need of the child and how we can coordinate those services between the accredited private and the public school.
When the count day on or around September 20th, and the kids that attend a private school are counted if they are special education?
If they receive services in a public school.
So, okay, that's a good statement. So if private school A has 10 students that are receiving special education services from USD 1, USD 1 sends a special education teacher and a para to this private school A.
That's countable.
That is countable. So are they receiving base fund and special funding, or just special funding?
I'm going to ask Frank for an answer on that one.
Phone a friend, Dr. Harwood.
So in order to receive special education services from the school, the student has to be enrolled in the school. And then whatever portion of the enrollment in the school they have, the school would be eligible for that portion of the general fund. But remember that that portion is subtracted out of how we get around to paying for things, not specifically from that school. But, so yes, if the district is providing the services, then they could have some enrollment in that school.
And to be fair to your questions, I'm going to ask my attorney, Brian Dempsey, to put together something that we can provide to you and to the task force, because I don't want to be putting my tongue out there and then realizing I need to step it back. So I can get that information, because you've got great questions and you need the right answers.
And I do have one more, Madam Chair. You've mentioned several times today about this IEP team, and that the team is making the decision. So if we have a team that is divided on what should be the best options for this child, who does this fall back on? Is it the parents? Is it the school? Is it what they're willing to do or not do?
All right, the free, appropriate public education and least restrictive environment is the responsibility of the agency. So they have to offer what they think is going to meet the needs of a student with disability once they're found eligible and have a need for services. Ultimately, the administrator will make the decision on what we're going to provide. And so then the parent can ask for dispute resolution if they disagree. Normally, you work with the parent. You may have several meetings. If it's the parent who's in disagreement, and oftentimes it is, then you want to work with that parent to see what you can do, because getting into dispute just puts a wall up between us, and we're not going to get to any type of good provision of services for the student, and it's all about the student. So that's why I said earlier, the administrator or administrative designee has the ultimate responsibility to say, yes, we can provide these services, and we will, and we can afford to pay for them.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when you are working with, I'm going to go back to my private school example. So student A in private school A and USD 1 is partnering, they're coming in and they're providing these services. Wouldn't the teacher who's a certified teacher at an accredited private school be able to provide those services
It depends
So-
on the agreement that you have on what you're going to provide. Many times it's speech services based upon the dollars you have and what that private school says we need. And then you may provide support at the private school. You can't send them money, but
Right,
you can send a
right.
person to the school. But if they come to the public school, that means that they're enrolled for that part of the day, and they should be working under a professional licensed person.
Okay, so if the, but what you said that the agency is required to provide FAPE and LRE. So if you are operating your services in a private school, and let's say one of the goals is that the student is now reading a full chapter a day. Just throwing that out there. And the classroom teacher in a public school is helping with that. Well, the classroom teacher in a private school is helping with that.
Yes.
So is it a fair statement that private schools are also, the teachers that are in these private schools, they are abiding by these IEPs?
They should be invited to any meeting that's being held about that student at the public school, because the IEP would be held at the public, and you are to invite any agency or any person that has knowledge or is going to be working with that student. So you want them at the table, whether that be the administrator from that private or the teacher, and you want them involved so they can be at the table to hear the same conversation.
I don't think I'm making.
I
I'm
don't
not
think
getting
I'm able to
anywhere.
answer your question because you're asking me to get in the weeds really far.
Well, because we have to be in the weeds on some issues.
I get it, and that's why I said I'll have Brian Dempsey.
I'm just really concerned that we have USDs in our state that are not providing services in the least restrictive environment for students because they're placed in a private school by a parent choice.
That's a good statement.
And the concern is that USDs are saying that they are responsible and can only ensure that an IEP is followed if they are in a public school building. And that's the concern I have, is we have private schools where these paras and these teachers are going in and the students are getting their services, but in the public, but they're saying that, well, we can't assure that they're actually getting these because they're not in a public school building. And I think we're getting stuck on this whole building thing.
Well, we have a services plan sometimes too of what we're going to provide. So that's where I want Brian to give you clarity on exactly what the law or regulation requires for private placement, private school students, how they can receive their special education services. I know we have it in one of our chapters in our Kansas Process Handbook.
That would be great if I would love that. So I'm not sure if anybody else in the committee
Well,
would
we'll
too.
make sure you get it.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
That's a great segue to preview tomorrow. Not that we're adjourning yet, we're not. But another factor that we'll be looking at tomorrow morning that I think will be new and informative to a lot of people is virtual schools and special education services. So private schools, you know, where are students receiving services? How does that look? Are there opportunities to do it better? Dr. Harwood.
I was just going to point out that the link for the Kansas Special Education Process Handbook is included in the handout, so everybody has that for those specific situations that may go well beyond what this particular task force is talking about.
And I will make sure you get that electronically so that you all will have access to not only the process handbook, but the categorical aid reimbursement guide, as well as the Kansas Special Education Eligibility Indicators, which I think Matthew already had figured out and gave to you today.
Yes, and those are all on the handout that Mr. Moore provided. Representative Estes.
Mr. Moore, thank you. You made a statement that when you were responding to Representative Steele about the carryover money, and it said, it appears like we are carrying it over. If it's not carried over, where does it go?
That's a frank question.
I think it is being carried over, but it wasn't budgeted to be carried over. It was budgeted to be spent, but when you can't hire the staff, you can't spend the money, so then it carries over. So then what he said after that is that I may readjust, certainly with things going on, but the inability to hire staff, because you have to budget like you're going to hire them, does add to cash balances. And it's something that we hadn't really talked about, but when you have the number of, especially in special education, the number of vacancies that we have, it does add up quite a bit.
I think that you're correct, and it's not unique to this agency. It happens across all of ours that we have that problem. What is your sense, and the other superintendents here are welcome to jump in and answer this question. So when that happens, is it being left over in that carryover account, or is it being transferred into the next year to fill in a shortfall before state general fund is transferred over for a shortfall?
So in some ways, because we're based on a reimbursement model, I budgeted to spend the dollars, but I couldn't hire the staff. So I'm not going to get reimbursed for the staff that I didn't hire. So in some ways, it just makes it so that it does carry forward, but I didn't get money to replace what I didn't spend. And so at the end, I have that there, and so it may add up a little bit, and then you have to think about, but the other part that my mandatory transfers are based on the special education state aid that I receive. If I didn't receive the funds and didn't have the expenses, then I will transfer less because I don't have the expenses because I didn't have them there. But I think that the important part is it does make it harder to budget, because when you are trying to fill staff positions and can't, you're still hoping that you can, and you may fill them in February, and then it's how much you have there. But I'll let the others talk about how they do that specifically now, if they'd like.
Dr. Gibson.
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you. I think Dr. Harwood said it best. It really is a continuation. So for example, in the district I currently serve, last year at this time, we had 40 para vacancies, 40. They were unfilled. So you still budget, because you hope at some point throughout the year you can fill. This year, it's 20. So we're in a better position. So once again, that carryover funds did help us get those people on board. We do adjust the budget as we go along. In a previous district, we had a situation where a couple students moved in with high needs, and had we not had the carryover, which inherently partly was because we weren't filling the positions, we would not be able to meet their needs financially, would have to adjust the budget. And so I think it's those things. Then, of course, we are in a position that school districts are funding more of special education, and therefore the funds that aren't used are just helping offset the increased costs into the next year as well.
And I think that's part of what I'm asking, because if you're going to have a certain amount of carryover, you're going to have a certain amount of responsible cushion, but I'm wanting to make sure that what's being carried over is used before we're transferring in SGF, and I don't have a sense of that.
We do. I can assure you that that's the first thing off the top, is those carryover funds take care of those, of course, once again, the first quarter. And those are the funds that we use first before we start reallocating those funds, with the exception of those things that are flow through and or dictated through Medicaid, et cetera.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Harwood.
And so, kind of what I talked about, as I said, that you probably want 25 to 30% carryover because of cash flow. And so if I have a lot of vacancies, and so if I don't do anything, my cash balance might get up to 35%, I would transfer less in. And so I would try to keep it at that. Now, at the end of the year, it may look like, well, I didn't spend that money, so it was there. And because we do the cash balances on June 30th of the year, but then I would make up for that next year and not transfer as much general fund dollars in, again, because I don't have the requirement to, because I didn't get as much state aid because I couldn't fill the positions I originally thought I could.
And that's always what I think the legislature feels, that, or at least I should never speak for the entire legislature, but I and many I speak to express, we're looking at the cash balances. The way that we're doing the budgets, we don't know a whole lot about why they're there, how much is there, and we want to make sure that as much of this is getting to the classroom as possible, especially in special ed. So I think there's room for us to all communicate better on that.
Okay, before we ask some more questions, I do have a quick question because I'm hearing one of the reasons we have this carryover. One, it's concerning because we see increased balances, which I get the time frame of when disbursements are made. But when you see increased balances year over year, that tells me that may not be the sole reason. But going back to because we have so many vacancies, in the information we were presented back in May, we are, according to this data, I would like, if you have different data, I'd like to know what it is, that we are the 7th highest staff sped state with 1 FTE per 4 special education students. And like I say, the data that I'm looking at from May puts us as the 7th highest. So with all these unfilled vacancies, I mean, I'm wondering then, are we shooting for number 1? I mean, I'm trying to figure out because it compared to other states, we are heavily staffed. So is that what you see? Or, because I'm hearing we have a whole lot of vacancies, but I'm not seeing that in the data that we were presented.
I really don't know how to answer that, Senator Erickson, because I don't have the data in front of me on the needs in our state. I know that if you talk to directors, they'll tell you that they don't have enough staff, and we have more and more students that are needing one-on-one support. Now, I don't know if Frank has something he wants to share, but that's what I'm seeing. And I think, Matthew, didn't you say that we were 5.2 to 1 in that staff ratio?
Madam Chair, with my calculations, it was 5.25, but again, that was utilizing what I could have position names, so
Okay.
I would guess that there is some error in that.
I guess I have to say I don't know.
Okay, Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see you have a paper. I just wasn't sure what your source was, so I was wanting to be able to find it if you could tell us. Thank you.
Yes, and if you don't have this or need it, this was from the May meeting. It's the state of the state special education in Kansas. So if you want to refer to that, and if, like I say, if there's different numbers out there, I'm just going off of what we were given in May, which would be helpful. Okay, Representative Estes.
Thank you. Did I understand you correctly that you said there's a regression formula that you use?
It is for extended school year services. Many still use the regression model to determine extended school year need to identify students as eligible to receive ESY.
Okay, and you're looking at that on a student-by-student basis?
Absolutely.
Okay. And that makes sense, and it's rational to do something in a mathematical basis. And so my question is, if you're able to measure loss, can we measure gain?
I think we do that through the progress monitoring of the IEP as well as the grade level performance of the students and how they're moving from grade to grade. I don't know if I'm catching it, but ESY is a maintenance program. It's not to build skills. ESY is to make sure the student doesn't regress during breaks in school days. So it's just to maintain, because what we found years ago is that those breaks, we had many students, we get back to November and they were just where they were when they left in May. And that's where this came into play, to figure out how do we keep them from having that loss over extended breaks.
I think that our school calendar is another conversation, because I'm not sure that it's helping us. But my point is, if we can remember, I don't know, I just think that we need to figure out if we can measure loss, somehow we can measure gain. And I think that's important. I think it's important for families and parents and educators to know we made gains, we did well. It also helps guide our decision-making on, oh, we made more gains when we did this than we did that. But my last question for you is about the professional development. And are there guardrails that make sure that that professional development is very specifically related to special education, whether it's for helping a para manage behavior issues, science of reading, dyslexic reading, and so on.
Normally, under a professional development plan, the individual comes up with what they think they need to keep their professional development current. It could be that they need letters training to work on structured literacy. It could be that they need to go to behavior symposiums so that they can learn techniques to work on behavior with kids. It's really individualized. It's not something where we just try to group everybody into one pot. The only time that we do have the common in-service really is at the beginning of the year when we have to go over changes in our IEP documents or other documents, or our processes, procedures, what we learned last year that didn't work and how we want to improve that this year, any new initiatives that the agency, interlocal co-op or district want to present. Because the important thing is they are supporting general education instruction through specially designed instruction. So they also need general education skills in ELA, math, science, social studies. And when you get into high school, you're dealing with career technology education. You've got transition services. That would be a specific area of PD for a high school teacher. So I think, again, grade level, content, and then specific needs of that person. And they work that out with their supervisor because supervisors normally have to approve all professional development.
Okay, and that's the guardrails that I'm asking about. I'm glad that it's individualized. That makes sense, but I just want to be very careful that what we're counting as professional development is very applicable, and wanted to know how we manage that. So is there anything beyond supervisor?
The PDC plan is put into place every year because teachers have to collect professional development points for renewal. They can do that through college credits, but they can also do it through approved in-service. And so that is policed by both the local level professional development council, the supervisor, as well as the professional development collection that is kept on that individual, each individual. So there are numerous ways that we look at that, but I think what we want to do is we want to improve the practice. And when you do observation on staff, you see weak areas, you can recommend then what you want them to have in the way of development. I sent several teachers to Cradle to Career training, which had shown marvelous results for a couple of my students. And they had students with autism that they were struggling with. It made all the difference in the world to teach reading. So I'm just saying we individualized it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Director Ricker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think what this is actually a request of Matthew, and if it's, I wouldn't expect it to be deliverable by tomorrow, but certainly before September. If you could take a look, the Edgenomics handout that this data comes from has data sources listed at the bottom of the page with the staffing ratios. Maybe it would help us understand how that aligns or compares or substitutes for the analysis in the presentation you gave us, which I presume to be based on data you gathered from KSDE. And that is not a named source in the Edgenomics packet. So it would just help bring some clarity to the conversation, because I do think it's an important one to think in terms of staffing versus student needs and how we're bridging that gap.
And I have asked our research department to take information and data from here and say, can you please run it through the department? And maybe that's not one that ran through. I know some of the increases and decreases in enrollment and so forth, I asked them to rerun with KSDE's input. So we'll make sure we get those, because we want it to be absolutely Kansas specific and Kansas data. So appreciate that. Okay. Seeing no other questions, Mr. Moore, thank you so much for answering the questions and being willing to be our in-house expert on special education for the task force.
Not a problem. If anybody has any questions afterward, just send them to me and we'll find you answers.
Thank you so much. This was very, very helpful. So, Task Force, tomorrow you will see we have a lot of time built in for discussion. I hope it works as well as it did today to just kind of build it in as we go, and then we can always have some final discussion. I think tomorrow that will be especially helpful as we kind of look at where we are in relation to special ed funding and what we are looking toward perhaps doing. So please come prepared for that conversation. Also, please note we do have hard copies of preliminary minutes for January, February, and March. If you would please look those over. Cindy Rexer, our committee assistant, works so hard on getting these and getting them accurate for us. So please look those over. We will. That'll be the first order of business tomorrow. So if you have any corrections or anything, please bring those to the table tomorrow. Appreciate everyone's input and everyone being here today. Have a great evening. We are adjourned.